37 days before an army of 100,000 wipes his kingdom off the map. 8,000 soldiers on paper, 5,000 in reality. And he himself is trapped in the body of a sickly prince who is slowly being poisoned by his own courtiers. A special forces soldier who fought in Kandahar has woken up inside a boy whom everyone calls the Paper Prince. The first thing Dominic Khan feels is cold. Not pain, not fear. Cold. Wet sheets cling to a foreign body. The arms are thin, the wrists like a teenager's. The fingers are white, without a single callus. He opens his eyes and sees a stone ceiling with beams. The window is narrow as a loophole. The air smells of dampness and bitter herbs. This is not a hospital, not a morgue. This isn't his world at all. He sits up and scans the room. A glowing panel appears before his eyes. The commander's system is activated. And in that very second, a stranger's memory hits him like a bucket of ice water. The third prince, Kyron Halin. 19 years old, sickly, despised. The last heir to a dying dynasty. His brothers are dead. His father is fading. The neighboring empire of Kanvol is marching a 100,000-strong army on the capital. 37 days until the vanguard. Dominic closes his eyes. He exhales through his nose on the count of 4. That's how he was taught 20 years ago at Fort Benning. That's how he breathed in Kandahar when their group was cornered in the village. That's how he breathed in the hospital when he found out that Ramirez hadn't returned. First, assess the situation, then everything else. He looks at his hands. 58 kilograms. A body that collapses after a kilometer of running. Can't draw a hunting bow, won't go out into the field to cut down the enemy. But his mind works. His mind works perfectly. The door creaks. A gray-haired doctor enters. His eyes are frightened. His hands are shaking. He asks how His Highness is feeling. Dominic answers in the same voice he used to speak to frightened recruits before their first sortie. Quietly, without emotion. He says he feels fine. He asks for a map of the kingdom, a list of all the guards officers with their service records, and food, something with protein. The physician freezes. In 20 years, he has never once heard the prince say more than 3 words in a row. And here, whole sentences. And the eyes. His eyes have changed. Before, they held the emptiness of a dying man. Now there is something in them that makes the old man want to straighten his back. He bows and leaves. Dominic remains alone, staring intently at the glowing panel. Stamina critically low. Muscle mass below normal. Chronic effects of poisoning. He freezes on the last item. Not an illness. Not a fever. Poisoning. Someone is poisoning this boy. Slowly and methodically. Dominic pushes the thought to the back of his mind. Not now. There are more important tasks right now. 37 days. 100,000 enemies. 5,000 of his own. 2 understaffed fortresses. And a body that won't make it to the stables. He stands up. His legs are unsteady. He makes his way to the window. Below lies the capital. A small mountain town with stone walls. Beautiful. Quiet. Doomed. People walk the streets, unaware that in a month their kingdom will be gone. Dominic looks down and counts. A habit from his first tour in Afghanistan. When things are bad, you don't dwell on how bad they are. You count. How many roads lead to the city? How many towers on the walls? How wide the gorge is to the north? Where the bottlenecks are on the passes? The system helps. It overlays his knowledge with the memories of Prince Kyron. The boy read a lot. He knew the geography of the kingdom better than any general at court. He just didn't know what to do with it. Dominic knows. An hour later, the healer returns. He brings porridge with goat cheese and dried meat, and an old, worn map on parchment. Dominic unfolds it and studies it in silence for 20 minutes. The system scans the lines and converts them into digital data right before his eyes. A mountain kingdom. 3 passes to the south and west, 1 to the north. The capital in the Central Valley. The roads are narrow. Convoys crawl along them slowly. Very slowly. Dominic smirks. For the first time in this body. Crooked and short. Mountains. Narrow roads. Slow supply trains. An army of 100,000 is used to fighting in open fields. Phalanxes. Knightly cavalry. And this is where the fun begins. Canval doesn't understand that mountains aren't fields. Here, their numerical superiority becomes a problem. 100,000 men need to be fed, watered, moved along roads where 2 horsemen can't pass, stretching the supply trains for kilometers. In Afghanistan, Dominic saw how the world's most powerful army got bogged down in these mountains. It will be the same here, if everything is done right. He asks for the captain of the guard to be summoned. The physician hesitates. He says that Captain Sanjeevan is on the wall and is unlikely to come at the first call. In Chiron's memory, this captain is the only one who did not openly despise the prince. But there was no respect there either. More like indifferent pity. Like for a sick little animal kept at court because it's of royal blood. Dominic tells the physician that he's asking, not ordering. Let him convey that the prince wants to discuss the route of the Canval vanguard. If he's not interested, let him not come. The captain appears 40 minutes later, gloomy, 40 years old, a face marked by old scars, the eyes of a man who has seen too many deaths to keep count. He stands by the door. He doesn't bow. By etiquette, this is a breach. In reality, it's honest. Why bow to a boy whom the entire court calls the paper prince? Dominic doesn't notice. He's sitting on the bed in front of a map eating porridge. He nods toward a chair. The captain sits down. The silence drags on for about 10 seconds. The captain studies the prince. Something has changed. He doesn't understand what. The boy is the same, thin, pale, weak. But his eyes. In his eyes is something the captain has only seen in people who have spent too much time staring death in the face. Dominic speaks first. He asks how many truly combat-ready soldiers they have, not on paper, in reality. The captain answers after a pause. On paper, 8,000, in reality about 5,000. The rest are cripples and recruits who've never held a sword. Dominic nods. He asks about provisions. Enough for 3 months if they switch to siege rations. About horses. 320, no more than 100 combat ready. About archers. 200, 40 good ones at most. Dominic fires off questions one after another, quickly, precisely, to the point, without a single superfluous word. The captain answers, and with each answer he sits up a little straighter in his chair. He doesn't understand what's happening. A week ago, this boy couldn't get out of bed without help. And now he's asking questions that no general at court has ever asked. 20 minutes later, Dominic falls silent. He looks at the map, then at the captain, and says he has a plan. Not a defense plan, not a plan to sit behind the walls and wait to be crushed, a plan to destroy Canval's vanguard before the main forces arrive. For the first time, the captain shows emotion. He smiles. Bitterly and bitter. He says the vanguard consists of 2,000 soldiers with experience from 3 campaigns, and the prince won't have enough strength to make it to the stables. Dominic doesn't argue. He just points to a spot on the map, a small village at the mouth of the southern pass. He asks if the captain knows it. Sorim, 20 households, nothing special. Dominic says the Canval vanguard will pass through this village in 9 days. The supply train will stretch for 1.5 miles. There's no rear guard because the enemy is certain that Halin's army is holed up behind the walls. The captain asks how the prince knows this. Dominic replies that it's the only logical route if you think with your head instead of your coat of arms. The Southern Pass, the only road wide enough for the supply train. Sorum stands at the narrowest point of the pass. Before and after it, the road is squeezed between the cliffs, a perfect ambush. He asks for 20 of the best scouts, for 9 days. If he's wrong, let the captain hang him personally and rid the kingdom of a useless prince. The captain is silent for a long time. He looks at the map, at the prince, back at the map. Then he stands up and says he'll give him 20 men. Not because he believes it, but because he has nothing left to lose. He leaves. Dominic finishes his porridge. He lies on his back and closes his eyes. The system flickers quietly in the corner of his vision. 36 days until the main forces arrive. He remembers the parking lot by the bar in San Antonio. The knife went into his kidney, and he bled out in 12 minutes. A stupid death. Pointless. 4 years after he survived Kandahar and Helmand and 3 more operations that can't be talked about. He died in a parking lot breaking up a drunken brawl. And now he's here, in the body of a boy being tormented by his own courtiers, with an army that doesn't know how to fight, against an empire that knows no defeat, with a system that doesn't make him stronger, but only helps him think faster. He opens his eyes, stares at the stone ceiling, and quietly says to himself in English, "It's been worse. It was worse in 2010. The next morning, Dominic got up before dawn. His body ached. Every muscle throbbed as if he'd run a marathon, even though he'd only walked from the bed to the window and back a dozen times. The system issued a dry report. Moderate muscle atrophy, weakened heart muscle. Chronic poisoning from mountain aconite had been impairing bodily functions for the past year and a half. Dominic read it and memorized it. Mountain aconite, cumulative effect, subthreshold concentration. Someone had done this skillfully, not killing, but slowly extinguishing, turning a living person into a vegetable. There was a knock at the door. A young servant entered with a tray, morning decoction, hot and bitter. Prince Chiron had been drinking it every morning for the past year and a half. Dominic looked at the cup. The system dispassionately displayed the text before his eyes. Mountain aconite detected. Subthreshold concentration. Cumulative effect. He picked up the cup, took a sip, set it back down, smiled at the servant and thanked him. The servant bowed and left. Dominic watched him go. He memorized the face, the hands, the gait. The way the servant's gaze lingered briefly on the cup as the prince raised it to his lips. He didn't yet know who was behind the poisoning. The servant might just be a pawn, or he might be the key. But now was not the time. A single sip of poison a day wouldn't kill him, not at that concentration. And if he stopped drinking the brew, the poisoner would realize he'd been exposed and start acting differently. Let him think everything was going according to plan. Dominic got dressed. It took 10 minutes because the prince's clothes were uncomfortable. Long hems, wide sleeves. The fabric was beautiful, but useless. He made a mental note to ask for something simpler, something he could move in. He left the room and headed for the courtyard. Every step was a struggle. The stairs in the castle were narrow and steep. Halfway down, he stopped and leaned against the wall. He was breathing heavily. His heart was pounding. The system showed a pulse of 130 from just walking. He clenched his teeth and kept going. Captain Sun was waiting for him in the courtyard. 23 people stood beside him. Dominic counted them. He'd asked for 20 but got 23. That meant one of two things. Either the captain had decided to provide a reserve, or the 3 extra men had come of their own accord to see the mad prince. Dominic approached and stopped in front of the formation. His height in this body was slightly above average, but because of his thinness he looked like a stick. The soldiers looked at him, and in their eyes was the same thing: mockery, disbelief. One burly, red-bearded fighter didn't even bother to hide his smirk. Dominic didn't give a speech. He didn't explain the plan. He didn't try to look imposing. He simply began to walk around the formation, slowly, stopping in front of each one. The system worked. As he looked at a soldier, a file would pop up before his eyes: name, age, basic stats, stamina, reaction time, psychotype, hidden talents. The first, Park Tae-min, 32 years old, high stamina, average reaction time, stable psychotype, former infantryman, 10 years of service, injury to the left knee, sniper. The system didn't use that word. It displayed a tag. Visual acuity in the top percentile, hand stability while holding a target above average, ability to concentrate on a single target. Dominic understood. This man could become the best marksman in the unit if given the right bow and taught how to breathe properly. Second, Chi In-guk, 25 years old, former poacher, caught a year ago. Serves time in the garrison dungeon for killing a deer in the royal forest. Average stamina, very high reaction speed, unstable psychotype, hidden talent, tracker, ability to read the terrain, ability to move silently in forest and mountain terrain. Dominic nodded and moved on. Third, fourth, fifth. He examined each one for 10 seconds. He made a mental note of some. He passed over others. He stopped at the 11th, a skinny guy with shifty eyes. Lee Myung-ho, 20 years old, former clerk at the garrison, discharged for theft. Low stamina, slow reaction time. Physical parameters below average across the board. Hidden talent. Dominic read it and paused. Photographic memory. The ability to memorize and reproduce visual information. A perfect memory for routes and faces. This isn't a soldier. This is a scout. A man who can walk a trail once and then draw it later with precision down to the last rock. Dominic finished his inspection. He returned to the front of the line. He looked at Captain Sun and said he needed 17 men out of 23. He named them. The captain listened, and his expression changed with every name. Because Dominic had weeded out almost everyone the captain considered the best. He weeded out the red-bearded bruiser. He weeded out 2 experienced swordsmen. He weeded out the decorated veteran. But he kept the poacher, the thief, a skinny, limping guy who turned out to be a former hunter with phenomenal hearing. The captain asked directly, why? Dominic replied that he didn't need heroes. He needed people who knew how to move silently, to see in the dark, to read tracks, to memorize routes, to endure hunger and cold. For the job he had planned, a decorated swordsman was useless. But a poacher who had roamed the mountains for 10 years without ever being caught by the gamekeepers was worth 10 nights. The captain was silent. He didn't agree. But he had given his word and kept it. Dominic asked for 3 more, from those not in the garrison. The first request was strange. He asked to find a girl from a mountain village, a shepherdess. One of the scouts had mentioned that a girl lived in the foothills who walked barefoot through the snow and saw tracks that no one else could see. The captain said he knew who he was talking about. A savage from the mountain clans, half beast, doesn't speak a normal language. Dominic said he didn't care about her language. He needed her legs and her eyes. Second request. A former sapper from the Western Fortress, discharged after a concussion. His hands shake, but he's the only one in the army who's worked with black powder. Third request. A deserter. A former sergeant named Pek Sonu. He fled the garrison 3 months ago. He must be hiding somewhere in the eastern foothills. When the system evaluated his file from the archives, it highlighted a single line that made Dominic pause. Leader of a small group, natural talent, ability to lead between 3 and 12 people in self-sufficient conditions. That was exactly what he needed. A squad leader. A man who could take 5 men into the mountains for a week and bring them all back alive. Captain Sun said the deserter was to be executed. Dominic replied that he could be executed after the operation, if the deserter wanted to. The captain left to carry out the order. Dominic stayed in the courtyard. He sat down on a stone bench because his legs could no longer hold him up. 17 plus 3. 20 men. That's not enough. Catastrophically insufficient. But in 2010, in Helmand Province, his 12-man team trained and deployed 40 local militia fighters for an operation in just 3 weeks. They raided an ammunition depot guarded by 200 militants. We lost, too. It will be harder here. There are no radios and no night vision goggles here. No helicopter to evacuate the wounded. No air support. But the principle is the same. A small group, surprise, knowledge of the terrain, a strike on a vulnerable point, withdrawal before the enemy realizes what has happened. By evening of the first day, Dominic had gathered 17 hand-picked fighters in an empty barn behind the castle wall. They stood and looked at him, some with curiosity, some with irritation. The poacher Cho Inguk stood against the wall with his arms crossed, staring at him with open defiance. He didn't understand why they'd dragged him out of the pit, or why a skinny boy in princely robes was staring at him like he was a thoroughbred stallion. Dominic didn't bother explaining much. He spoke briefly. In 9 days, they would head into the mountains. Their mission was to destroy the convoy of the Canval vanguard and kill its commander. There would be 20 of them. There would be 2,000 enemies. If anyone wanted to leave, they should do so now. No one left. Not because they believed him, but because each of them was at a point in their lives where they had nothing left to lose. The poacher faced the noose. The thieving scribe faced prison. A beggarly old age awaited the former hunter with a limp. They stayed because even the prince's insane plan was better than what awaited them without it. Dominic understood this. He'd seen it before. In Afghanistan, local fighters followed him not out of patriotism, but because he paid them, gave them weapons, and treated them like human beings. Motivation would come later, when they saw that his methods worked, when they survived their first operation, when they returned and realized they had become something greater than they were before. For now, it was enough that they were here. He started with the basics: running, stretching, basic formations. Move in pairs, cover each other's backs. Don't shout in battle. Communicate with gestures. The system provided him with ready-made training programs adapted to the group's current level. He couldn't demonstrate them himself. His body wouldn't let him. So he explained with words and the help of the scribe Lin Young-ho, who drew diagrams with charcoal on wooden boards. By nightfall, all 17 were lying on the barn floor, breathing heavily. Dominic sat on a crate and drank water. His legs trembled just from walking among them. But his voice was steady. He said that tomorrow would be harder, and the day after tomorrow, even harder. In 9 days, they would either be ready or they would all die. The poacher Choi Inguk lay on his back and stared at the ceiling. Then he turned his head toward the prince and asked why he was doing this. Why was the prince messing around with scum instead of fleeing to a neighboring kingdom and living out his days in comfort? Dominic looked at him and said quietly that there are no weak soldiers. There are commanders who haven't figured out what this man was made for. The poacher was silent for about 5 seconds. Then he smiled, but differently than before, without malice. On the 3rd day, a mountain girl arrived. Dominic was standing by the barn when Captain Sun led her by the hand as one leads a captured animal. Small, wiry, barefoot despite the cold stone beneath her feet. Tangled hair. Clothes made of coarse wool patched in 10 places. Eyes like a cat's, dark and wary. Cho Min-soo, 17 years old. a mountain shepherdess from the village that the Conwall scouts burned down 2 weeks ago. Sister System pulled up her file, and Dominic lingered on it longer than on any other. Endurance, extremely high. Reaction time, in the top percentile. Visual acuity, exceptional. Curing, 40% above normal. Hidden talents, top-tier tracker. Ability to navigate mountainous and forested terrain without landmarks. Reading the weather by the scent of the wind. Silent movement across any surface. This was no talent. It was a gift. A natural tool honed by 17 years of life in the mountains, where a single misstep means death. Minsu stood and looked up at Dominic. She didn't understand why they had brought her here. She spoke in a rough mountain dialect, and Captain Sun translated half the words with a look of disgust on his face. She said her village had been burned down, that her mother and younger brother were dead, that she had walked through the mountains alone for 3 days without food, that she was no soldier and didn't understand why the prince would want a savage. Dominic listened. Then he crouched down in front of her. It was hard for him. His knees cracked and his vision darkened, but he crouched down. Because you can't talk down to someone when you want them to trust you. He told her he knew who had burned her village, that those people were coming here, that he was going to stop them, and that he needed someone who knew the mountains better than the mountains knew themselves. Minsu was silent. She looked into his eyes, not at his clothes, not at the crown that wasn't there, not at his slender hands, at his eyes. And she saw something there she didn't know the name of. She nodded, briefly, once. Dominic stood up. He turned to Captain Sun and said she needed boots. The captain raised his eyebrows. Boots for a savage. Dominic put it differently. She needed custom-made boots, not military ones, not men's. Lightweight, soft soles, a high arch under her foot, with fastenings for mountain terrain. He described the design in details that astonished the captain. How did the sickly prince know so much about the construction of footwear? Dominic knew because at the ranger school at Fort Benning, footwear was the difference between a living soldier and a cripple. He sent the order to the blacksmith through the captain and returned to training. On the 4th day, a deserter arrived. Pek Sonu, 28 years old, broad-shouldered, of average height, calm face, intelligent eyes. They found him in a cave in the eastern foothills. He had lived there for 3 months, hunting mountain rabbits and gathering roots. When they brought him in, he didn't resist. He just walked, silently. Captain Sun wanted to put him in shackles, but Dominic forbade it. He spoke with Pek Sun one-on-one in the barn. He asked why he had deserted. Pek Sun answered without emotion. His unit had been sent to the southern border. 12 men. The order was to stand and hold the bridge. No reinforcements, no retreat plan. Just stand and die to ensure the main forces could withdraw. He stood. He held the bridge for 2 days. He lost 8 men. 4 survived. When they returned, the regimental commander didn't even remember sending them. No one said thank you. No one buried the 8. Park Sun-woo wrote a report. The report was lost. He wrote a second one. It was lost again. The 3rd time, he didn't bother writing it. He left. Dominic listened and said nothing. He knew this type. He'd seen dozens like him in the army. The best sergeants, chewed up and spit out by the system. Men who cared more about their men than their careers, and were punished for it. He told Park Sun that he could offer him one thing: command of a 5-man unit in an operation that would most likely end in death. But if they survived, each of the 8 who died on that bridge would have their name engraved on a stone, and their families would receive a year's salary. Park Sun-woo looked at the prince for a long time. Then he asked just one thing. Would there be an evacuation plan? Dominic replied that an evacuation plan would be the first thing he drew up, because an operation without an evacuation plan isn't an operation. It's murdering your own men. Park Sun-woo nodded and said he agreed. By the 5th day, the team was assembled. 20 men. The system displayed the roster, and Dominic studied it for a long time. 3 squads of 5 men each, plus a 3-man reconnaissance team, plus the reserve squad commander and himself. First squad, Assault. Commander, Bek Sonu. 5 fighters with average to high physical stats. Their mission, close combat. Strike against the convoy's headquarters. Eliminate the vanguard commander. Second squad, long-range combat. Commander Park Tae-min, a sniper. 4 marksmen with the best accuracy records. Their mission, fire support from elevated positions. Third squad, sabotage. Commander not yet assigned. 5 men, including former sapper Ko Jun-pil with his trembling hands and knowledge of black powder. Their mission, to set the supply train ablaze. Reconnaissance team. 3 men. Min-soo, poacher Choi In-guk, clerk Lee Myung-ho with his photographic memory. Dominic trained them from morning until nightfall. He himself couldn't run or demonstrate techniques, but he could explain, and he explained like no one else in the world could. Because he wasn't teaching fencing or drill steps, he was teaching what they teach in Special Forces school. Moving in pairs, covering sectors, coded hand signals, silent movement at night, navigating by the stars, first aid, tourniquets, bandaging, transporting the wounded, how to carry a person in a 3-man team along a mountain trail without dropping him or making a sound. The soldiers didn't understand half of what he was saying, not because they were stupid, but because no one in this world had ever fought like that. Here, war was about formation, about a wall of shields, about a knight charging ahead and slashing. Here, there was no concept of a small group operating in the rear. There was no concept of reconnaissance by combat. There was no concept of an ambush as a primary method of combat. Dominic was shattering their worldview, and they resisted, especially on the 6th day, when he ordered everyone to wash up in the stream behind the barn, a cold mountain stream, in October. The fighters decided the prince had finally lost his mind. The poacher Cho In-guk asked why. Dominic replied that a man who stinks from 200 meters away cannot set up an ambush. Dogs can smell it, horses can smell it, a sentry with a normal nose can smell it. They smell like a herd of goats. If they want to be invisible, they must smell like the forest. The poacher thought for a moment. Then he smirked. Then he stripped and waded into the stream first. He had been a poacher for 10 years. He knew the prince was right. He just had never heard an officer put it into words like that. On the 7th day, Dominic gathered all 20 of them around the map. The map was drawn on a large board. He had drawn it himself based on the prince's memory and data from the system. The village of Sorin, the pass's throat. A road squeezed between 2 cliffs, 4 meters wide at its narrowest point. The narrow section is about 2 kilometers long. Before and after the narrow section are small clearings where a convoy could turn around, but it couldn't form up in battle order. Dominic showed the plan. The reconnaissance group would move out 2 days before the operation. Min-soo would lead. She knew these mountains. She had grown up there. They would find positions for each unit, mark retreat routes, count the sentries, note the convoy's guard schedule. When the column enters a narrow section, the first phase begins. The long-range unit fires from cover above. The targets are commanders on horseback, officers with distinctive insignia. They will be riding at the head or in the middle of the column. Take out the commander. Without a commander, 2,000 soldiers in a narrow gorge are not an army, but a mob. Phase 2. The sabotage unit sets fire to the supply train at the rear of the column, black powder. Ko Jun-pil knows how to make incendiary charges. The burning supply train blocks the retreat. Phase 3. Baek Sun-woo's assault unit strikes the column's headquarters. Quickly, 30 seconds. Kill the commander if he's still alive. Take the standard. Get out. Phase 4. Withdrawal. All 3 units retreat along pre-scouted mountain trails. The reconnaissance group provides cover. The rendezvous point is 12 kilometers to the north. The entire battle must take no more than 8 minutes. 8 minutes from the first shot to full retreat. The fighters listened in silence. Baek Sun-woo was the first to nod. He understood. He could see how it might work. The others weren't sure, but they said nothing. Dominic finished and said one last thing. He wouldn't be going with them. Physically, he wasn't capable. He would wait at the rendezvous point. They would go alone, under Park Sun-woo's command. Park Sun-woo looked at him. There was something new in his eyes. Not trust yet, but something close to it. Respect for a man who knows his limits and doesn't hide them behind someone else's back. On the 8th day, the boots for Min-soo were ready. The blacksmith had made them according to Dominic's design. Soft leather, felt lining, a multi-layered sole with spikes for mountain terrain, lightweight, a perfect fit for her foot. Dominic brought them to her himself. She was sitting by the fire behind the barn, sharpening a knife. He placed the boots in front of her and said nothing. Min-soo looked at them, then at him, then back at the boots. She picked one up. She turned them over in her hands. She felt the lining. She sniffed the leather. She had never in her life worn shoes that were made for her. All she had were hand-me-downs from her older brother. And now, standing before her, were boots tailored to her foot. She put them on. She stood up. She walked around. She stopped. And she looked at Dominic the way a person looks when, for the first time in their life, they realize that someone has seen them. Not a savage, not a mountain half-beast, a human. She said nothing. She nodded. Once, just like that first time they met. Dominic nodded back and walked away. The 9th day, the last before they left. On the 9th day, the group left the city under cover of darkness. Dominic stood on the wall and watched as 20 figures faded into the pre-dawn twilight. Min-soo led the way, in new boots, silent as a shadow. Behind her, Cho In-guk. The poacher moved differently after 7 days of training, more composed, quieter. Baek Sun-woo brought up the rear. His group was last. He looked back once. He looked at the wall, at the prince's silhouette. He nodded and vanished into the darkness. Dominic remained. The following days were the hardest of his new life, not because it was dangerous, but because there was nothing he could do. Only wait. In Afghanistan, he had moved with the group. He was close by. He saw. He controlled. Here, he stood on the wall and looked at the mountains. The system displayed a map, a reconnaissance tablet. But there was nothing on it. Just a static map of the terrain. No markings, no data. Because data only appeared when his fighters saw something and transmitted it. And there was no communication, no radios, no drones. 20 men had gone into the mountains and disappeared. He could only hope he'd trained them well enough. He'd made the most of those days. On the 10th day after arriving in this world, Dominic entered the throne room for the first time. King Halen IV sat on the throne. No, he wasn't sitting. He was propped up. Pillows held him on both sides. His face was gray. His eyes were cloudy. His hands were like dry twigs. Regent Chancellor Cho Won-sik stood nearby. He was portly, well-groomed, with small eyes that moved faster than his thoughts. Dominic read everything he needed to know from him in 10 seconds. The system confirmed it. Manipulator psychotype, zero loyalty to the crown, hidden ties to foreign powers. Chancellor Cho looked at the prince with a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. He said he was glad to see His Highness on his feet, that the court was praying for his health, that in such difficult times the kingdom needed wisdom, not passion, and that he, the Chancellor, was already negotiating with Canval regarding honorable terms. Dominic listened. He didn't interrupt. He let the Chancellor finish speaking. It was important. Let him show his hand. The Chancellor was proposing surrender, an honorable one, with the aristocracy retaining their titles, with those who swore allegiance to the empire retaining their landholdings, with the chancellor retaining the office of chancellor for himself. The only thing that would not be preserved was the dynasty. Prince Chiron would have to abdicate, or die. The chancellor didn't care which option it was. Dominic listened until the end, then he looked at his father. The king was staring off into the distance. His mind was far away. Medication or something else. Dominic suspected it was something else. He turned to the chancellor and said calmly that he appreciated his concern, that he would make a decision when he was ready, that for now he would like to see the kingdom's financial reports for the past year. The chancellor blinked. Financial reports? The paper prince had never taken an interest in finances. He promised to prepare them and took his leave. Dominic knew the reports would be doctored, but that was information too. What a person hides says just as much about them as what they reveal. He returned to his chambers. On the table stood his morning brew, cold. Dominic picked up the cup. The system confirmed mountain aconite, sub-threshold concentration. He drank it, set the cup down. He sat down at the map. The system updated the reconnaissance tablet, not from his fighters, from another source. A trade caravan that had passed through the Eastern Pass yesterday brought rumors. Canval's main army had split into 3 columns. The central column, under the command of General Yu Tae-sun, numbered 60,000. The northern column has 20,000. The southern column has 20,000. The vanguard of 2,000 has already passed through the southern pass and is moving according to plan. Dominic looked at the map and did the math. 3 columns means General Yu wants to attack from 3 sides. A classic encirclement. Straight out of the textbook. That's exactly how they fought here for 300 years. Build a wall around the enemy and overwhelm them with numbers. General Yu's problem was that he didn't know who he was dealing with now. On the 11th day, a woman came to Dominic. Tall, straight back, short hair tied in a bun, a men's military uniform, a beautiful but stern face, as if carved from stone. Son Hayun, 26 years old, daughter of Captain Son Jivon, the only woman officer in the Heilin Guard. The system displayed her profile. High stamina, very high reaction speed. Psychotype, stable and tenacious. Hidden talent. Leader of the assault team. Ability to make decisions under stress is 60% above average. She entered without knocking, stood before him, and said she wanted to know where her father had sent 20 men. Her voice was steady. No plea, a demand. Dominic looked at her. She looked back at him. No deference, no fear. No trace of the pity that was in the eyes of the others. She saw before her a skinny boy who had sent 20 soldiers into the mountains, and she wanted to know why. He could have lied, could have ordered her to leave, could have cited military secrecy. Instead, he showed her a map. He showed her the operation plan. He explained the calculations. 8 minutes, 3 phases, 20 men against 2,000. Ayun listened. She didn't interrupt. When he finished, she was silent for about 20 seconds. Then she said the plan was either brilliant or suicidal. Dominic replied that usually they were one and the same. She didn't smile, but something in her expression changed. She asked why he hadn't taken her. Dominic replied that he had a different task for her, a more difficult one, a more important one, and longer than a single ambush in the mountains. She raised an eyebrow. He said he needed a commander for the assault team of the main unit, which he would begin forming once the 20 returned. Not a team of 5 people, a group of 30. The first assault company in Heilin's history. She would command it, if she agreed. Ayun looked at him for a long time. Then she asked why he thought she could handle it. Dominic replied that it was the system. No, he put it differently. He said he saw something in her that she herself didn't yet see. that she had spent her whole life wearing other people's standards like a foreign uniform, and he was offering her a task tailored to her. She left without giving an answer. Dominic wasn't expecting an answer today. He knew her type. She needed time to process it, to decide for herself, without pressure. On the 12th day, nothing happened. On the 13th, nothing either. Dominic trained his body. He walked around the castle. He climbed up the stairs. He went down. He ate as much protein as he could get his hands on. The system showed a slow improvement. His resting heart rate dropped from 110 to 95. Muscle mass had increased by 400 grams. For an ordinary person, that's nothing. For a body that had been tormented for a year and a half, it was a small miracle. On the 14th day, in the morning, Dominic was awakened by noise in the courtyard. Shouts, the neighing of horses, the clang of iron. He got up and went to the window. Down below, at the castle gates, stood a group of horsemen. 22. Not 20, 22. He counted 3 times. 22. His men had left in a group of 20. 22 had returned. Dominic rushed out into the courtyard as fast as his body would allow. Steps, a corridor, more steps. His head was spinning by the time he reached the gate. They were standing there, all 20 of them. Dirty, exhausted, some with bandages, but all of them. 20 out of 20. And with them, 2 others. 2 Canvolian prisoners tied to their saddles. And a sack. Park Sun stepped forward. He untied the sack and placed the head of the Canvol colonel, the vanguard commander, at Dominic's feet. The courtyard fell silent. Captain Sun stood by the wall. His face was changing. Dominic saw it change. From disbelief, through shock, to something the 40-year-old veteran hadn't allowed himself to feel in a very long time. Hope. Pek Sun began his report, briefly, to the point, just as he had been taught over the course of 7 days. They reached their positions on the 11th day. The reconnaissance group under Minsu's command had spotted the column exactly where the prince had indicated. The village of Sorim, the pass's throat. The supply train stretched for 1.5 miles. Rear security was minimal. The vanguard commander was riding in the middle of the column on a white horse. They began at dawn. The long-range unit struck first. Park Tae-min took out 2 officers with the first 2 shots. The rest of the archers took out the horsemen. In the first minute, the column lost 7 commanders. The sabotage unit set fire to the supply train at the rear. Ko Jun-pil, his hands trembling, assembled 4 incendiary charges from black powder and oiled cloth. All 4 went off. The rear of the column turned into a wall of fire. Baek Son-woo's assault unit entered via the right flank, 30 seconds to headquarters. The vanguard commander, Colonel Huang, tried to organize a defense. He didn't make it. Baek Son-woo killed him personally. He took the standard. Retreat. All 3 fled along the trails Minsu had scouted. The Kangwol soldiers did not pursue. They did not understand what had happened. 2,000 men were scrambling about in a narrow gorge without command, with a burning supply train behind them. By noon, they began to retreat. The supply train burned completely. 3 weeks' worth of supplies. The colonel is dead. 2 captured officers were taken for interrogation. The group's losses: 0 killed, 3 wounded. Not a single serious injury. The operation, from the first shot to the complete withdrawal, took 7 minutes, 1 minute less than planned. Captain Sun Ji-won stood and listened. When Baek Sun finished, the captain turned to Dominic. He looked at him and slowly dropped to one knee. It was more than a bow. It was an acknowledgement. A 40-year-old veteran who had seen 3 wars knelt before a young man whom, just a week ago, he had considered a nobody. Silence hung in the courtyard. The garrison soldiers watched from the walls. The servants froze in the doorways. 20 dirty fighters stood behind their commander, and for the first time since they had left the barn, they felt that they were not a rabble. They were a squad. Dominic approached the captain. He touched his shoulder and told him to stand up, because they had a lot of work to do. 37 days had passed. The vanguard had been destroyed, but the main army was still advancing. 60,000 men under the command of General Yu Tae-sun. And when the general finds out what happened near the village of Sorim, he'll come not as a conqueror, but as a man who's been personally insulted. Dominic looked at his 20 fighters. Dirty, tired, alive. And he thought that this was only the beginning. After the group's return, Dominic gave the fighters a day's rest, not a moment more. On the 16th day, he gathered all 20 in the same barn and began debriefing the operation. He didn't celebrate, he didn't praise, he analyzed. Baek's son reported every second. Dominic listened and took notes on the board. 3 mistakes. The first, the long-range unit opened fire 2 seconds before the signal. Park Tae-min explains that the target was moving out of the firing zone and he had decided to shoot. Dominic nodded. The decision was correct, but coordination had broken down. The sabotage unit was not yet in position. Ko Jun-pil said his men had run the last 100 meters. One of the charges nearly went off prematurely from the jostling. The second mistake. The assault team took 40 seconds instead of 30. 10 seconds too long. In a real battle, 10 seconds is a matter of life and death. Baek Sun-woo said that the passage along the right slope was narrower than shown on the map. 2 of them got stuck. Dominic noted this. The reconnaissance team was supposed to check the path personally. Min-soo remained silent. She knew she was to blame. Third mistake. During the retreat, one of the squads took the wrong trail. They lost 4 minutes regrouping. Not critical this time. Critical next time when the enemy is smarter. Dominic finished his debrief. He looked at the fighters and said they'd done well. Not great. Well. For a first operation with 7 days of preparation, it was a decent result, but it would get harder from here on out. General Yu Tae-sung is not Colonel Huang. He cannot be taken down with a single ambush. The fighters listened. They were already different. After the village of Sorim, something in them had changed. Poacher Che In-guk no longer stood with his arms crossed defiantly. He sat and listened, intently, like a man who had realized that these strange methods worked and wanted to learn more. Clerk Lee Myung-ho was sketching a diagram of the analysis in his notebook. His photographic memory recorded everything. A year later, these notes would grow into the first field manual of the Haeleen Army. But no one knew that yet. Dominic moved on to the next topic. Expansion. 20 men made up a reconnaissance group. For what he was planning, he needed 100. He called it the Pass Ghosts Unit. He didn't come up with the name. The system suggested it. He agreed because, in special operations, a name is important. It creates an identity. A man who bears a name fights differently than a man without a name. He announced a recruitment drive. Each of the 20 was given the right to recommend candidates. The criteria were the same. Not strength, not lineage, not experience in the ranks, but hidden talents, a keen eye, a light step, the ability to endure, the ability to think, a willingness to learn. By the evening of the 16th day, 73 candidates stood by the barn. Dominic walked the ranks. The system was working. Cards flashed before his eyes. He weeded them out quickly and ruthlessly. Out of 73, he took 41. Some decisions shocked Captain Sun. Dominic took a woman. The widow of a soldier from the garrison, 30 years old, 3 children. Average stamina. Average. Reaction time, average. But the system revealed what no one else had seen. Absolute calm under pressure. A crisis leader psychotype. The ability to make decisions when everyone around her is panicking. Dominic made her the commander of the medical unit. Captain Sun objected, openly and sharply. He said a woman had no place in the unit, that this wasn't an army. but a circus. That the prince was taking just anyone and would soon be taking children and old people. Dominic listened. He didn't argue. He asked the captain to wait 2 days. Then, during training, he showed him how the medical unit under this woman's command evacuated a wounded soldier from a simulated battlefield in 3 minutes. Bandaging, tourniquet, transportation. All according to the standard he'd written overnight, drawing on his memory of tactical medicine courses at Fort Benning. The captain watched. He said nothing. 2 days later, he came to Dominic and said he'd been wrong, briefly, without an apology, in a military manner. Dominic nodded. That was enough. On the 17th day, what Dominic had been waiting for and fearing happened. Chancellor Cho struck back. In the morning, leaflets appeared on the castle walls. Someone had posted them during the night. The text was simple. Prince Chiron has gone mad. He is sending people to their deaths. His new army is a gang of criminals and savages. The only path to salvation is peace with Canval on the Chancellor's terms. The leaflets were all over the city, at the market, by the temple, by the barracks. The work was professional. The Chancellor had been planning this for more than a day. Dominic read the leaflet and folded it. He had expected this sooner. The Chancellor felt he was losing control. Sorim's success had made the prince dangerous. Before, he could be ignored. Now he had 20 fighters and Captain's son behind him. Not many, but enough to prevent surrender. Dominic did not respond publicly. He did not tear down the leaflets. He did not accuse the Chancellor. He did something else. He asked for 2 Canval prisoners from the village of Sorim to be brought in. The interrogation took place in the council chamber, in front of witnesses. Dominic invited everyone, the Chancellor, the generals, the senior officers, the aristocrats, the courtiers, everyone who had a voice at court. The prisoners were brought in, 2 officers from the Canvolian vanguard. Dominic interrogated them calmly, without threats, without torture. He asked questions to which he knew the answers, and watched to see where they were lying and where they weren't. The first prisoner spoke about the army's composition. He confirmed 3 columns. He confirmed the total strength, 80,000.
Not 100,000.
Dominic noted this. Either Helen's intelligence had inflated the numbers out of fear, or Canval had deliberately exaggerated the figures to intimidate. The second prisoner revealed something more interesting. The terms of surrender that Canval had offered to the kingdom of Helen did not match what Chancellor Cho had said. The Chancellor had told the court about honorable terms, retention of titles, retention of lands, a peaceful transition. The captured officer told the truth. Canval demanded the complete disbandment of the Helen army, the confiscation of all fortresses, the execution or exile of the royal family, and the transfer of the mountain mines to the empire. Titles would be preserved only for those who personally swore allegiance to the emperor. That is, for the Chancellor and his people. The rest would lose everything. Silence hung in the hall. Chancellor Cho turned pale. Dominic did not look at him. He looked at the generals, at the aristocrats, at the people who an hour ago had been ready to support surrender because they believed their titles and lands were safe. Now they knew the truth. Canval was not coming to save the aristocracy of Helen. Canval was coming to destroy it. Everyone except those who had sold out beforehand. Dominic let the silence hang in the air. Then he spoke a single sentence. He said that the 20 men he had gathered and trained in 7 days had destroyed Canval's vanguard without a single casualty. The Chancellor suggested they surrender. He suggested they fight. The choice was theirs. He stood up and left. He said nothing more. He didn't pressure them. He didn't threaten them. He didn't beg. He let the people decide for themselves. That evening, 4 generals came to see him. Old men, gray-haired, with faces that hadn't changed in decades. They didn't come to swear allegiance. They came to ask questions. The same kind of questions Dominic had asked Captain Sun on the first day. Concrete, military, to the point. How many people could be trained in 2 months? Which passes could be held with small forces? How the supply system proposed by the prince worked? Dominic answered for 4 hours. He showed maps. He drew diagrams. He explained the concept of echeloned defense in mountainous terrain. Not the kind of defense they knew here, hiding behind walls and waiting, but a different one, an active one, with mobile units, with minefields at the passes, with decoys, with ambushes at every turn of the road. The generals listened. They disagreed with half of it. They argued with the other half. But they came. They asked questions. That was the beginning. On the 18th day, Hayun came again, without knocking. She stood before him and said one word. "I agree." Dominic nodded. He asked her to sit down. He pulled the bundle from under the table. He unwrapped it. Inside were blueprints, armor, not the standard men's armor she'd been wearing. Lightweight, redesigned, chest protection reinforced, the shoulder pads reduced so as not to restrict her swing, the hip plates shortened for mobility, a third lighter than standard. And next to it, a blueprint for a weapon, a short konchar sword. Narrow, lightweight, designed for her arm length and grip strength. Not a woman's weapon, a weapon designed for a specific fighter, for her leverage and her reflexes. Hayun looked at the blueprints for a long time. She ran her fingers along the lines. Dominic was silent. He knew what she was seeing. For the first time in her life, she was seeing something made for her. Not adapted from a man's, not a scaled-down copy, but the real thing, her own. She said quietly that she'd been carrying someone else's all her life. Dominic replied that it wouldn't be that way anymore. She looked up. There was something in her eyes she couldn't name herself. Not love, not yet, but a crack in the wall she had been building for 26 years. She took the blueprints and left. Dominic watched her go. Then he opened the system. He looked at his tactics rank, D, beginner. The system displayed the promotion requirements. 1 operation successfully completed with 0 casualties. Done. Rank upgraded to C. New training programs available. Coordination of multiple units at the company level. Night operations. Counter-sniper work. Creation of false positions. Psychological operations. New equipment blueprints. A light crossbow with a new type of trigger. A camouflage cloak made from local materials. Signal flares using black powder. Dominic read the list and felt something shift quietly inside him. Not joy, not relief. The sensation that the machine was picking up speed. 20 people returned alive. The Chancellor is weakened. 4 generals have come to listen. Hayun agreed to command the assault group. Her rank has been promoted. New tools have been unlocked. And somewhere beyond the mountain passes, General Yu Tae-seon learns that his vanguard has been destroyed, that the supply train carrying 3 weeks' worth of provisions has burned, that the commander is dead, and that all this was done by 20 men. The general is not one to fly into a rage. He is a professional. He will pause, regroup, think. And when he comes again, he will come prepared. Dominic closed the system panel and walked to the window. The sun was setting behind the mountains. The city below went about its usual life. People didn't know that today everything had changed, that the small mountain kingdom everyone thought was dead had just bared its teeth. He looked at his hands, thin, pale, the hands of a sickly boy. With these hands, he couldn't lift a sword, couldn't pull a bowstring, couldn't run a kilometer. But with these hands, he drew the plan that destroyed 2,000 soldiers. With these hands, he designed armor for a woman who had worn someone else's her whole life. With these hands, he would change the world, or die trying, for the second time. News of the vanguard's rout reached General Yu Tae-sun on the 5th day after the operation. A messenger rode up to headquarters on a worn-out horse and fell from the saddle right in front of the commander's tent. The general listened to the report while standing. He didn't sit down. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He asked 3 questions. How many attackers? How they attacked? How many casualties among the attackers? The messenger answered. About 20. From an ambush. Estimated casualties among the attackers? 0. General Yu was silent for 2 minutes. His staff officers exchanged glances. They expected an outburst of anger. They expected an order to drop everything and march on the capital at forced march. General Yu did not give such an order. He ordered all 3 columns to halt, to set up a fortified camp, to reinforce the guard on the supply trains, and to send him everything intelligence knew about the 3rd prince of Heilian. The staff officers were surprised. The 3rd prince? A paper boy? The sickly heir to a dying dynasty? What could there be to know about him? General Yu looked at them and said that 20 men had wiped out a vanguard of 2,000 without suffering a single casualty. This is no boy. This is someone else. And until he figures out exactly who, he won't take a single step. This bought Dominica some time. Not much. 2 weeks, maybe 3, but enough. He made the most of every day. On the 19th day after waking up, the 2nd wave of recruitment began. 41 new fighters joined the 20 veterans from the village of Sorim. 61 people, 39 short of 100. Dominic divided them into training groups. The Sorim veterans became instructors. Each of the 20 received between 2 and 4 new recruits. The system helped. It generated individual programs for each instructor-student pair. It took psychotypes into account. If an instructor was quick-tempered, he was given a calm student. If a student was slow to learn, he was given a patient mentor. Dominic couldn't be everywhere, but he could see everyone. Every morning he made his rounds of the training grounds. The system scanned the fighters. It showed their progress. It flagged problems. One fighter had dislocated his shoulder. Another hadn't slept in 2 days from nerves. A third was in conflict with an instructor. Dominic resolved every problem personally, quietly, without shouting, without punishment. He would approach the fighter with the problem and talk to him, not like a prince, like a commander who knows that people break down not from the strain, but from the lack of meaning. He explained the reason to everyone. Why run until dark? Why learn hand signals? Why wash up? Why bandage a wound this way and not another? Why count steps on a march? People who understand why endure 3 times as much as those who don't. Dominic knew this from Fort Benning. On the 22nd day, he met Han Yun for the first time. A court physician, 22 years old, quiet, calm, long, precise hands. She came to the barn on her own, without an invitation. One of the fighters had broken a finger during training, and she heard a scream from the medical room. She came, set the finger. She applied a splint, quickly and without unnecessary words. Dominic watched. The system displayed a profile. Han Yun, stable psychotype, fine motor skills in the top percentile, hidden talent, field surgeon, ability to treat wounds under stress, resistance to the sight of blood. Dominic approached her after she finished. He thanked her. He asked if she knew what field medicine was. She didn't know. Here, doctors worked in palaces and temples. On the battlefield, the wounded were carried to the rear if they were lucky. If not, they were left to die. Bandaging in battle was considered impossible. Dominic said that could be changed. He suggested she establish a medical unit attached to the regiment, not a doctor's office in a palace, but a field unit that would accompany the soldiers and treat the wounded right on the spot. Yona listened. Then she asked why the prince cared about ordinary soldiers. Usually, wounded soldiers were written off and new ones were recruited. That's how it had always been. Dominic replied that every trained fighter represents 6 months of training. To lose him on the battlefield because no one bandaged his wound, that's not war, it's wastefulness. He framed his concern in terms of efficiency. But Yona heard what he didn't say. She nodded and agreed. The next day, Dominic brought her the blueprints, a field first aid kit, a compact leather bag with 10 compartments, bundles of braided cord, bandages of standardized width, antiseptic, distilled alcohol infused with mountain herbs, splints made of light wood, a needle with coarse thread for sutures, instructions for applying each item drawn by Lee Myung-ho based on Dominic's description. Yona laid everything out on the table. She examined each item. She touched the cord. She tried tying it, untying it, tying it again. She looked at the antiseptic. She sniffed it. She asked why alcohol and not an herbal decoction. Dominic explained that alcohol kills the decay in a wound. A decoction does not. They didn't know that here. Doctors washed wounds with water or herbal decoctions that smelled pleasant but did nothing. Soldiers died from infection more often than from the wounds themselves. Yona listened, and her eyes changed. She was a doctor. She had seen people die from wounds that seemed trivial, a cut on the arm, a scratch from an arrow. A week later, infection. 2 weeks later, death. And now this skinny boy was explaining to her why and how to stop it. She asked how he knew this. Dominic said he had read old treatises. It was a lie, but a convenient one. Yona didn't believe him, but she didn't press the issue. Over the next week, she taught 4 fighters basic first aid. Dominic called them medics. Each unit was supposed to have 1 person capable of stopping bleeding and applying a splint before the doctor arrived. Yona worked 16 hours a day, silently, methodically, without complaint. On the 25th day, Dominic came to her at night, not as a prince, as a patient. He brought a cup of morning decoction. He set it before her and asked her to identify what was in it. Yona looked at the cup, then at the prince. She took the decoction, sniffed it, tasted a drop on her tongue. Her face changed, slowly, like a cloud covering the sun. She said she tasted a bitterness that shouldn't be in this mixture. Dominic said he knew, that he was being poisoned, that there had been poison in the brew for the past year and a half, that it was mountain aconite in a sub-threshold dose. It doesn't kill immediately. It kills over 2 years. It turns a person into a vegetable who can't get out of bed. That was exactly what was happening to the real Prince Chiron. Yona was silent. Her hands didn't tremble. She was a doctor. She had seen death. But this was different. This was murder stretched out over a year and a half. She asked why he kept drinking. Dominic replied that if he stopped, the poisoner would know he'd been exposed. He'd start acting differently, maybe through the food, maybe through the water, maybe through a knife in the back. As long as the poisoner thinks the poison is working, he's calm, and Dominic needs time. Yona looked at him for a long time. Then she said she could make an antidote, not a complete one, a partial one, a herbal concoction that would neutralize some of the aconite in his system, not all of it, but enough to slow down the accumulation. Dominic would be able to drink the concoction and not die. Dominic nodded. He asked her to make it, and he asked her to keep it quiet. No one must know. Yona agreed. And in that moment, something arose between them that was neither love nor friendship. It was complicity, a shared secret. They stood together against an invisible enemy, and both knew that the price of a mistake was death. Yona asked one more thing. She asked if he knew that her teacher, the chief physician, had been executed for the death of the crown prince. Dominic knew, from Chiron's memory. Chief physician Park Un-soo was accused of poisoning the first prince and executed a year ago. Yona was his student. After the execution, no one touched her, simply because she was too insignificant to waste time on. She said quietly that her teacher was innocent, that he had been framed, that the real poisoner was the same person who was now poisoning Chiron. Dominic looked at her. He said they would find him, and that when they did, her teacher's name would be cleared. She didn't cry. She wasn't the type to cry. But her hands on the table relaxed slightly, as if she had kept her fists clenched for 2 years and had finally allowed herself to unclench her fingers. On the 28th day, the detachment reached 78 men. They were 22 short of 100. Dominic began to form specializations. 3 companies. The reconnaissance company, Commander Che In-guk, a former poacher, now the squad's best tracker after Minsu. 20 men trained to move through the mountains as silently as ghosts. Assault company, Commander Song Hayun, 25 men. Close combat, quick strikes, retreat. Long-range combat company, Commander Park Taemin, 20 men, archers and crossbowmen. A new crossbow with a trigger mechanism based on the system's blueprints was already in production. The blacksmiths worked around the clock. Dominic didn't give the blueprint to the head blacksmith. He gave it to Kim Dae-hyun, the blacksmith's daughter. He came to the smithy at dawn when she was working alone. Her father was still asleep. She stood at the anvil, shaping a horseshoe with her bare hands. Tall, broad-shouldered, her forearms marked with burn scars. Her apron scorched in 10 places. The system displayed a card, and Dominic read it with an interest he rarely showed. Kim Dae-hyun, 19 years old, high stamina, physical strength in the top quartile, even by men's standards. Hidden talent, master armorer, intuitive understanding of metal, ability to work with new blueprints without extensive training. Dominic placed the crossbow blueprint on the table next to the anvil. Dae-hyun looked at it, then at the prints, then back at the blueprint. She picked it up, unfolded it. She studied it for about 5 minutes. She ran her finger along the lines of the crossbow. She frowned. She poked at one spot and said that the fastening wouldn't hold here if made from ordinary steel. Hardened steel was needed. Dominic smiled. She had spotted the error in the blueprint in 5 minutes, a mistake he'd left there on purpose to test her. He said she was right, and that he wanted her to make the first prototype. Dae-hyun raised her eyebrows. She asked why not her father. Dominic replied that she'd do a better job, not as a compliment, as a fact. She looked at him for a few seconds. No one in her life had ever said those words to her. No one ever came to her with a blueprint. Everyone went to her father, and she stood by handing him tools. She said she'd have it done in 4 days. Dominic said she had 3. She smiled, nodded, and turned to the anvil. 3 days later, the first crossbow of the new type lay on the table in front of Dominic. He picked it up. Light, compact. The trigger mechanism allowed the bowstring to be drawn with one hand. The range was 40% greater than a standard bow. The accuracy was significantly better, and most importantly, it didn't require the archer's strength to fire. Any soldier, after 2 days of training, could hit a target 100 meters away. Dominic handed the crossbow to Park Taemin for testing. Taemin fired for an hour. Then he came over and said 2 words. It works. By the 30th day, Dae-hyun had assembled 5 crossbows. By the 35th, 15. She worked 20 hours a day. Her father saw what she was doing and said nothing. He didn't understand why the prince had come to his daughter and not to him, but the result spoke for itself. On the 32nd day, Dominic met Evelyn Cartwright for the first time. She arrived on horseback via the northern pass with a caravan of 4 wagons and a guard of 12 swordsmen. The ambassador of the Velmore Trade Republic. Dominic was standing on the wall when the caravan appeared on the road. He saw a woman at the head of the column, blonde hair, a dress not of local cut, a straight posture in the saddle. She rode the way people ride who are used to being watched. The system pulled up her file before Dominic had a chance to make out her face. Evelyn Cartwright, 24 years old, Ambassador of the Velmore Trade Republic. Psychotype. Analyst manipulator. 5 languages. Hidden talent. Top-tier negotiator. Ability to read an interlocutor and control the course of a conversation. Dominic went down to meet her. Chancellor Cho was already bustling about in the castle courtyard. He had known about Velmore's visit in advance. He planned to use it to his advantage. The Trade Republic could serve as a mediator in the surrender negotiations, or a source of money for escape. The Chancellor had prepared a reception, a table, wine, flowers, everything as it should be for an ambassador of a great power. Evelyn entered the courtyard and stopped. She surveyed the castle, the walls, the people, an instant assessment. Dominic recognized that look. That's how spies look when entering an unfamiliar room. Exits, threats, positions. She looked at the Chancellor and smiled, politely, diplomatically. Empty. She looked at Dominic. The smile didn't change, but her eyes were different. She saw not what she had expected. She had expected a corpse, a sickly boy on his last breath, a formality before the kingdom's death. She saw a thin young man with eyes that held something that didn't fit in the dossier. The Chancellor led her to the reception hall. Dominic didn't go. He gave the Chancellor an hour. Let him present his version. Let him show his cards. An hour later, Dominic appeared in the hall. The Chancellor was speaking. He was explaining to Evelyn that the kingdom was doomed, that investing in Heilin was unprofitable, that Velmore should be helped with a peaceful transfer of power to Canval and granted trade privileges from the Empire. Evelyn listened with a face that betrayed nothing. Dominic entered. He sat down. The Chancellor fell silent. Dominic looked at Evelyn and spoke. Not about war, not about surrender, about saltpeter. Velmore is the largest exporter of saltpeter on the continent. Canval is the largest buyer. Canval uses saltpeter for fireworks and certain mining operations. But if Canval conquers Heilin, it will gain access to the mines and no longer need intermediaries. The price of saltpeter will plummet. Velmore will lose its largest market. Evelyn stopped smiling. For the first time during the entire visit. She looked at Dominic, and he could see the gears turning behind her eyes. She was calculating, estimating, evaluating. Dominic continued. He proposed a contract. Heilin would buy saltpeter and steel from Velmore at market price. The volume would be small to start with, but stable and long-term. In return, Velmore would provide a maritime corridor for shipments bypassing the Canval territories. The Chancellor turned pale. He realized what was happening. The Prince was bypassing him. He was shaping foreign policy over the Chancellor's head, directly with the foreign ambassador. It was a breach of protocol. It was an insult. And it was brilliant. Evelyn asked for time to think it over. Dominic nodded. He gave her 24 hours. She retired to her quarters. The Chancellor remained with Dominic. His small eyes darted about. He said the Prince was overstepping his authority, that foreign policy was the Chancellor's prerogative, that the King would not approve. Dominic replied that the King was ill and incapable of approving anything, that the Chancellor was negotiating a surrender without the heir to the throne's approval, that if anyone here was overstepping their authority, it wasn't the Prince. The Chancellor looked at him. Something cold flashed in his eyes. Not fear. Calculation. He realized that the Prince had become dangerous, truly dangerous. Not as a boy with 20 soldiers, as a politician. The Chancellor took his leave. Dominic was left alone. He knew he had accelerated the conflict. The Chancellor would now act faster, perhaps through an assassin, perhaps through Canvolian agents, perhaps through a military coup. Dominic had little time, but he'd always had little time. That evening, Evelyn came to him on her own, without an entourage, without guards. She knocked and entered. She sat down across from him, and she spoke differently, not like a diplomat. like a business partner. She said the saltpeter contract was interesting, but insufficient. Velmore wouldn't bet on the losing side for the sake of a small contract. She needed something bigger. Dominic pulled a scroll from under the table, unrolled it, a blueprint, an improved marine compass with magnetic declination compensation, and navigation tables next to it. The system had generated them on request, not magic, mathematics, trigonometry unknown in this world. Evelyn looked at the drawings. She wasn't a sailor, but she was from Velmore, a trading republic whose wealth rested on ships. She understood what a compass that didn't lie on the open sea meant. It meant new routes, new markets, a decade-long advantage over competitors. She looked up at Dominic, and for the first time, she saw him not as the prince of a doomed kingdom, but as a man worth more than his country. She asked quietly where he had gotten it. Dominic replied that it was a family heirloom. Heylin is a mountain kingdom. They don't need a compass. But Velmore needs it very much. She nodded, slowly. She asked what he wanted in return. Dominic said the blueprint was a gift to her personally, not to Velmore, to her family. If she used it correctly, in 10 years the Cartwright family would be one of the richest in the Republic, regardless of whether Heylin survived or not. Evelyn froze. She was used to trade, to exchange, to contracts, but a gift with no strings attached from a man who had nothing to trade but his future. This was something new. She folded the blueprints, stood up, walked to the door, stopped, turned around, said the contract for the saltpeter would be signed tomorrow, and added that he didn't look like a prince. Dominic replied that he wasn't a prince. She heard him, didn't understand. Or perhaps she did, but decided not to ask. She left. On the 35th day, the last of the 6 arrived. Yun Sar. Dominic wasn't looking for her. She found him herself, or rather, Captain Sun found him when he brought his daughter to the assault squad's training session. Sar was standing by the window in the castle corridor, looking out at the courtyard. Dominic walked past. He stopped. The system pulled up her file. Yun Sar, 27. The eldest princess of the neighboring principality of Terion, a hostage at the court of Heylin since the age of 13. 15 years old. Observer psychotype. Hidden talent. Perfect memory for faces and conversations. Ability to systematize social connections and identify patterns in behavior. Dominic read it twice. Perfect memory for faces and conversations. 15 years at court. Every ambassador, every courtier, every whisper in the corridors. This woman was a living intelligence archive and didn't know it. He approached her. She turned around. Graceful. Calm. A face that had learned to express nothing after 15 years of living in a cage. She bowed. Politely, out of habit. The way people bow who do it 1,000 times a day. Dominic asked if she remembered Ambassador Kangwol, who had visited 3 years ago. Sarah answered without hesitation. Ambassador Moon Hyun-shik. He arrived in the 4th month of the 3rd year of the reign. He brought gifts, brocade and jade. He met with the Chancellor twice, without witnesses. After the 2nd meeting, the Chancellor sent a messenger south. The messenger's name was Kwak Seung-ho. He returned a week later. Dominic listened and felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. She remembered everything. Names, dates, the messenger's routes, who whispered to whom, who changed their habits after the visit, who started spending more than they earned. 15 years of information, condensed and organized in a single mind. He asked if she wanted it to matter. Sarah looked at him. For the first time in 15 years, someone wasn't asking about her health or her mood. Someone was asking if she wanted her knowledge to be needed. She said quietly that she did. Dominic nodded. He said he had a job for her, a real one. He'd explain later, in private. She nodded, and in her eyes, behind the familiar emptiness, something alive flashed. On the 37th day, the Ghosts of the Pass unit reached 94 men. They were 6 short of 100. Dominic wasn't rushing the recruitment. Better 94 ready men than 100 with dead weight. He turned his attention to what he had been putting off. Intelligence, not military, internal. He began meeting with Sayre every evening, in secret, in a small room on the 3rd floor of the castle tower where no one ever went. She brought her memories. He brought his questions. Over the course of 3 evenings, they mapped out the court. Who was connected to Chancellor Cho? Who was connected to Canval? Who was neutral? Who was for sale? Who was afraid? Sayre recalled things with a precision that sent a chill down Dominic's spine. She remembered a conversation between 2 servants in the hallway 6 years ago. She remembered that the stable master had changed the horses on the night of the first prince's death. She remembered that the treasurer had started wearing a new ring a week after the Canval ambassador's visit. Every detail fell into place. Dominic saw the web. Chancellor Cho was at the center, but not at the top. Above him was someone in Canval, someone who had been playing the game long before the war began. The death of the first prince, the death of the second, the king's illness, Chiron's poisoning. These were no accidents. This was an operation, planned and stretched out over years. Whoever in the Canval Empire decided to destroy the Hylin dynasty from within long before the army marched on the mountain passes. Dominic ordered a seal for Sayre, a personal one, with the symbol of the Yun clan, the very symbol that had been banned at the Hylin court 15 years ago when she became a hostage. He found a jeweler in the city. He explained what was needed. A silver seal the size of a coin, a delicate engraving, the Yun clan's pattern, a crane over a lake. When he brought the seal to Sayre, her hands trembled. For the first time in all their meetings, she took the seal, pressed it to her palm, closed her eyes. She wasn't crying. She had crying by the time she was 20. But something in her face softened. Something that had been stone came to life. She said quietly that for 15 years she had been signing documents under someone else's name, if she signed them at all. Dominic replied that now she would sign with her own. He appointed her head of his own intelligence, without an announcement, without a decree, quietly, between the 2 of them. She would be his eyes and ears at court. She would filter information, separate lies from truth, identify Canval's agents, and no one would know. Sayre nodded, and for the first time in 15 years, she affixed her seal to a document. Dominic looked at the seal, a crane over a lake. Beautiful. On the 38th day, assassins infiltrated the castle, 2 of them, at night, through a window in the medical wing. They moved silently, professionally, their faces covered, short blades. Their target was Dominic. They didn't make it. Minsu was sleeping by the prince's door, not in the room, on the floor by the door, like a dog. She'd been doing this every night since she returned from Sorim. No one ordered her to. She decided on her own. She heard them 20 paces away, a sound no one else would have heard. A slight change in the rhythm of the dripping from the roof, the rustle of fabric against stone. She stood up, silently. She took a knife, not a bow. A bow was useless in the hallway. The first assassin died without realizing what had happened. The knife went in under his chin, from bottom to top. Minsu pulled the blade out and turned to the second one. The second one was faster. He struck. Minsu dodged. Not completely. The blade went through her shoulder. Not deep. She didn't scream. She struck back. In the throat. The second one fell. Dominic woke up to the sound of a body falling. He stepped out into the hallway. Minsu stood over the two corpses. Her left shoulder was covered in blood. Her right hand, holding the knife, hung down by her side. Her face was calm. She looked at the prince and said briefly in her rough mountain dialect that guests had arrived. Dominic looked at the corpses, then at Minsu, then at the wound. He called for Yona. The healer arrived a minute later. She treated the wound with antiseptic from the new first aid kit. She applied a bandage. The wound was not life-threatening. Minsu didn't even flinch. Dominic examined the corpses. The system helped. On one of them, he found a tattoo on the inside of the wrist, 3 rings. Sar identified the symbol the next morning, the Nightblades Guild. Mercenary assassins from Canvol, expensive ones. Someone paid a lot of money to make sure Dominic didn't wake up that morning. The question is who? The Chancellor, or someone in Canvol, or both. Dominic didn't want to investigate openly. He asked Sarah to dig quietly. She dug. 2 days later, she brought back an answer. The payment for the assassins had gone through the court treasurer. The treasurer was connected to the Chancellor. But the order hadn't come from the Chancellor. The order came from Canvol, via a secret messenger whom Sarah tracked by the changing of horses at the post stations. Canvol wanted to eliminate Dominic before General Yu launched his offensive. It's easier to kill one man than to fight the army he's building. Dominic understood the logic. In his place, he would have done the sense. He reinforced the guard. He assigned a night shift of 3 ghost fighters. Minsu remained at the door. She refused to leave. She said that was her place. Dominic didn't argue. On the 40th day, General Yu resumed his advance. Intelligence reported it. 3 columns were on the move again, slower than before, more cautiously. Reinforced security, patrols on the flanks. The general had learned his lesson. He didn't yet know exactly what, but he knew he needed to be more cautious. Dominic convened a military council, the first real council at which he spoke as commander and not as a sick prince. Present were Captain Sun, the 4 generals who had arrived after the interrogation of the prisoners, Hayun, Baek Sun, and Dominic. The Chancellor was not invited. It was a signal. Dominic presented a defense plan, not a defense behind the walls, an echeloned defense at the mountain passes. 3 lines. The first line, the ghosts of the pass. Mobile groups of 5 men, ambushes, raids, destruction of supply trains and command posts. The objective? To slow them down, to wear them down, demoralize. Not to stop, to slow down. Every day of delay is a day Dominic uses to prepare. Second line, fortified positions at 3 key passes. The main forces of the Heilin army, 5,000 men. Not in the open field, in fortifications, stone walls, a moat, sharpened stakes, decoys. Every pass must become a trap into which the Canvolian army will be drawn, losing men with every step. Third line, the capital. The last line of defense, the city walls, the garrison, the militia. The enemy must not reach this point, but if they do, the city will be ready. The generals listened. 2 nodded. 2 argued. One old general named Huan Dukpo said that this was not war, that a real war is when 2 armies meet on the battlefield and the strongest wins. And what the prince was proposing was banditry. Dominic looked at him and asked what was more important, honor or people's lives. General Huang replied that without honor, life is worth nothing. Dominic nodded. He said he respected his position, and that General Huang could command the second line of defense at the pass. There would be an honorable battle there, wall to wall, sword to sword, everything by the rules. The general was silent. Then he agreed. Dominic found a place for everyone, just as he found a place for every soldier, just as he found an owner for every item. He didn't break things. He used them. The council ended at midnight. Dominic returned to his room. He lay down on the bed. He closed his eyes. The system quietly displayed the countdown. Convol's main forces would be at the mountain passes in 25 days. 25 days to turn the mountain trails into a labyrinth from which no army in the world could escape. For the next 20 days, Dominic slept no more than 4 hours a day. He was torn between 3 fronts. The first front, the mountain passes. The ghosts had taken up their positions, 4 groups of 5 men each. Each group was self-sufficient, a week's worth of food. Retreat routes were marked, assembly points were designated. The signaling system was set up, signal flares using black powder. Ko Jun-pil had gathered 30 of them. A red flare meant the enemy had been spotted. A green one meant the way was clear. 2 reds in a row meant a large force was approaching. Primitive by the standards of his past life, genius by the standards of a world where armies only learn of the enemy when they see their banners on the horizon. The first group, under the command of Choi In-guk, destroyed the northern column's supply train on the 45th day. 12 wagons of grain. The escort of 20 soldiers was scattered, 0 casualties. The second group, under the command of Baek Son-woo, attacked the southern column's headquarters on the 47th day. The colonel and 2 communications officers were killed. 1 casualty, 1 wounded. The third group worked on the roads, barricades, felled trees, damaged bridges. Each roadblock delayed the column by half a day. Every day of delay meant provisions were used up. General Yu was losing supplies faster than they were being delivered. On the 49th day, he sent out a punitive expedition, 500 horsemen. Their mission was to find and destroy the guerrillas. They searched for 10 days. They found empty fire pits, tracks that led nowhere, decoy camps. Once they found a note tied to a tree. It had a single word written in the Hailin language. Welcome. The 500 horsemen returned empty-handed. General Yu listened to the report, in silence. Then he walked over to the map in his tent and stood before it for an hour. His staff officers didn't dare enter. The general was thinking. He hadn't faced anything like this in 7 campaigns. An enemy that wouldn't engage in battle, that struck and retreated, that destroyed supply trains rather than armies, that killed officers rather than soldiers. This was a different kind of war, and he didn't know its rules. The second front. Fortifications. General Hwang Duk-po commanded the construction of positions at Silver Pass, the main one of the 3, the widest, the most suitable for a large army. This was precisely where General Yu's central column was heading. Dominic designed the fortifications himself. 3 tiers. The first tier. A stone wall at the narrowest point of the pass, 2 meters high. Not enough for a siege, but enough to slow down the infantry. Behind the wall, a moat. Not deep, 1 meter, but with sharpened stakes at the bottom. In front of the wall, a strip of rocks and debris to prevent horses from gaining speed for an attack. Second tier. Positions for crossbowmen on the slopes on both sides of the pass. Stone shelters. The firing sectors overlap. There are no blind spots. Third tier. A reserve position a kilometer behind the first 2, in case of a breakthrough. General Hwang looked at the blueprints and frowned. This wasn't what he was used to. Not a fortress, not a castle. Field fortifications. Temporary, rough. But Dominic showed him the calculations. How many men it would take to hold such a position? 500. Against how many? 5,000. A ratio of 1 to 10. The general didn't believe the numbers. But the village of Sorum had also been impossible. And yet it happened. Third front. The courtyard. Chancellor Cho wasn't giving up. After the assassination attempt failed, he changed tactics. He stopped acting openly. He began working through rumors. The prince is mad. The prince is squandering the treasury on bandits. The prince insults the aristocracy. The prince is going to surrender the kingdom through a sham war and flee to Velmore. Every day a new rumor. Professional work. Dominic tasked Tsar with tracing the sources. She traced 6 out of 10. All led to the Chancellor's people. The remaining 4 were more interesting. They led to people who weren't directly connected to the Chancellor, but they were connected to Canvol, a parallel network. Dominic realized that the Chancellor wasn't the only imperial agent at court. There were others, independent ones, working directly for Canvol intelligence. He didn't touch them, for now. Better to know who they are and keep an eye on them than to eliminate them and lose the thread. On the 55th day, Evelyn arrived. The first shipment of saltpeter had come through the northern pass. 20 barrels. Not much, but it was a start. She brought more than just saltpeter. She brought information. The Velmore merchants had a network of contacts across the continent. Evelyn proposed sharing intelligence, not for free, mutually. Dominic agreed. They began the exchange. Through Velmore, Dominic received what Sayre could not provide. The big picture. What they were saying at the court of Canvol, what the Emperor was thinking, what General Yu was planning. The picture was bleak. The Emperor was furious. He had expected Heilin to fall within a week. 2 months had passed, and the small kingdom was putting up a fight. Officers had been killed, supply trains had been burned, the vanguard had been destroyed. 500 horsemen had returned in disgrace. The Emperor had given General Yu an ultimatum: take the capital before the first snow, or do not return. General Yu hastened the march. On the 58th day, the vanguard of the Canvol central column reached the Silver Pass. Dominic stood at the observation post, a rocky outcrop on the southern slope, with the spyglass Evelyn had brought from Velmore. Down in the valley, the army was on the move. Thousands and thousands of people. The banners of Canvol, red with a golden dragon, supply trains, siege engines, cavalry, infantry in formation. 60,000. It was like looking at a river, an endless stream of steel and people. Dominic stood and watched. His body trembled from the cold. This young man now weighed 61 kilograms instead of 58. He could run 3 kilometers without falling. He could climb a wall without getting out of breath. Progress. Small, but progress. Hayun and Baek Sonu stood nearby. Hayun in her new armor. Daehyun had finished it a week ago. Lightweight, tailored. Hayun moved in it as if she had been born in this metal. A konchar on her belt, short, fast, deadly in her hands. Baek Sonu was silent, counting the banners. Out of habit. He always counted. Minsu sat on a rock a little higher up, watching the trails. Her eyes missed nothing. She spotted the Canvol patrol 2 kilometers away before anyone else. Dominic lowered his spyglass, looked at his men, then down at the army, and said quietly that tomorrow it begins. The Battle of Silver Pass lasted 3 days. The first day began at dawn. General Yu sent 5,000 infantry to storm the first tier of fortifications, by the book. A phalanx, shields in a row, steady march, drums, beautiful, disciplined, doomed. They entered the pass in orderly formation and ran into a stone wall. Not a high one, 2 meters, but behind it stood General Huan's men. Spears from behind the wall, stones from above, and crossbows, new Daehyun crossbows. Park Tae-min's company operated from positions on the slopes, 20 crossbowmen. Crossfire. The bolt from the new crossbow pierced a standard Canvol infantryman's shield at 70 meters. The system fed Dominic real-time statistics. In the first hour, the Canvol infantry lost about 400 men. They hadn't advanced a single meter. General Yu withdrew the infantry. He wasn't a fool. He realized that a head-on assault through the narrow pass was a meat grinder. He sent out reconnaissance to the flanks to search for bypass trails. The ghosts were waiting. Che In-guk's group intercepted the reconnaissance on the northern slope. 5 Canvol scouts, 3 killed, 2 fled. Bexo's group Nu intercepted the second group on the southern slope. 4 out of 6 did not return. General Yu received the report. There are no bypass trails. Or perhaps there are, but they are under control. He thought it over until noon. Then he gave the order. Siege engines. By evening of the first day, the Conwall sappers had hauled 2 catapults up to the entrance of the pass. They began firing at the wall. Stones flew across the gorge and shattered against the masonry. The wall shook. General Huang stood behind the wall and didn't flinch. Neither did his men. They had been trained the old-fashioned way, but stood firm. That night, Dominic sent out a group led by Baeksun, 5 men. Their mission was to destroy the catapults. They set out in the dark. Min-Su led the way. 2 kilometers up the mountainside, bypassing the Conwall outposts. 3 hours of silence. They reached the catapult positions by 3 o'clock in the morning. 30 guards. Baeksonu did not attack the guards. He bypassed them. 2 fighters crawled up to the catapults and set fire to the oil-soaked cloth tied to the launching arms. The wood burst into flames instantly. The Conwall guards rushed to put out the fire. In the confusion, Baeksonu's group slipped away. 2 catapults were burned to the ground by dawn. General Yu had lost his siege engines. Day 2. General Yu changed his tactics. He didn't send in the infantry. He sent in everything. 20,000 for a frontal assault, 10,000 flanking the mountain slopes, a broad front, so the ghosts couldn't intercept them all. It was brutal, costly, and it almost worked. The Conwall infantry surged at the wall in waves, one after another. General Huang was losing men. By noon, the first tier was on the brink. The wall cracked in 2 places. Conwall soldiers broke through the breaches. Close combat, hand to hand, blood on the stones. Dominic stood at the observation post and watched. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from helplessness. He couldn't be there, couldn't raise a sword, couldn't take his place in the ranks, could only watch and give orders. He gave the order to Hayun, the assault company, 30 men, a counterattack on the breach on the right. Hayun led her men, in new armor, with a conchar in her hand. She moved like Mercury, fast, precise, ruthless. 30 assault troops struck the flank of the Conwall breach, 8 minutes of hand-to-hand combat. The Conwall troops were thrown back over the wall. Hayun returned with blood on her face, not hers. The left breach was sealed with stones and bodies. By the evening of the second day, General Yu had lost more than 3,000. The wall held. The flanking groups on the slopes lost their way in the fog that rolled in around noon. Ghosts led them down false trails. 2 groups got lost. One made it back to their positions. The other went into a gorge from which there was no way out. General Yu stood before a map in his tent. His staff officers were silent. 3,000 in 2 days, and not a single meter of advance. It was impossible. 5,000 defenders were holding off 60,000. The third day, General Yu did not attack in the morning. He waited. Dominic grew uneasy. For a professional, waiting is more dangerous than attacking. That meant the general was thinking. That meant he had found something. By noon, Dominic realized exactly what it was. The Conwallian cavalry. 10,000 horsemen. They didn't go through the pass. They went around the mountain, completely. A 2-day march along a trail the locals considered impassable for cavalry. General Yu led 10,000 horses along a goat trail along the cliff. He lost 500. The rest emerged behind the fortifications. Min-Su was the first to see them. She ran to Dominic, out of breath, eyes wide. She said one word: cavalry, behind the mountain. Dominic closed his eyes for 3 seconds. The system feverishly ran through the options. 10,000 horsemen in the rear, 5,000 infantry on the wall, 20 kilometers of mountain road between them. If the cavalry strikes the rear simultaneously with a frontal assault, the wall will fall in an hour. He opened his eyes, looked at the map, and saw what General Yu could not see. Because General Yu didn't know these mountains, but Dominic did. Through Chiron's memories, through Minsu's data, through the ghost's intelligence. The mountain ledge above the trail the cavalry was following, unstable, crumbly, thousands of tons of rock and snow on a slope at a 35-degree angle. A single targeted explosion would be enough to set it all in motion. Ko Jun-pil. Dominic sent for him. The sapper arrived 10 minutes later. His hands were shaking as always, but his eyes were clear.
Dominic asked how much black powder it would take to bring down the ledge. Ko Jun-pil looked at the map. He looked at the mountain. He estimated. He said 2 barrels would be enough if placed in the right spot, in the crevice at the base of the ledge. Dominic asked how long it would take. Ko Jun-pil said 3 hours if they weren't killed on the way. Dominic sent him with Minsu's group. 5 men, 2 barrels of gunpowder, 3 hours. He ordered General Huan to hold the wall, at any cost. Another 3 hours. General Huan nodded. He didn't ask why. He believed him. This stubborn old general, who had considered Dominic's methods to be banditry, believed him. Because in 2 days on the wall, he had seen that the plan was working, that the fortifications were holding, that the crossbows were striking, that the medics were saving the wounded. Everything the prince had said turned out to be true. General Yu launched the attack at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a frontal assault on the wall, a full-scale assault. All remaining forces. At the same time, the cavalry was to strike at the rear. The wall shook. The Kanwal soldiers climbed over the corpses of their own men. General Huan stood in the center and hacked away. Old, gray-haired, with a sword in both hands. His men stood around him, and not a single one retreated. Hayun threw her assault company into one breach after another. Her armor was drenched in blood. Conchar did not stop. 3 hours. The longest 3 hours of Dominic's life. He stood on a rock and looked through his spyglass, at the wall where his men were dying, at the mountain trail where Minsu was leading the sapper to the ledge, at the valley where the Kanwal cavalry was forming up for a strike on the rear. At 4:53, a column of white smoke rose above the mountain. Then a sound, deafening, heavy, as if the mountain had coughed. Then a rumble. The ledge gave way. Thousands of tons of rock and snow and debris broke loose from the slope and crashed down onto the trail where the Kanwal cavalry stood. The avalanche lasted 9 seconds. When the dust settled, the trail was gone. The cavalry was gone. 10,000 horsemen were buried in 9 seconds. Those who survived were at the head or the tail of the column, no more than 2,000. General Yu heard the rumble. He saw the dust above the mountain, and he understood. He gave the order to retreat. Not to panic, to retreat. An organized one. That was the moment when Dominic realized that General Yu was a true military man. Even in the midst of disaster, he didn't lose his head. He led the remaining forces out of the pass, gathered them in the valley, counted them, and left. 60,000 had come. Fewer than 40,000 left. Casualties, killed, wounded, and buried, numbered at least 20,000. The wall had held. Dominic sat down on a rock. His legs wouldn't hold him. His hands were shaking. His body, which weighed 61 kilograms, decided it couldn't take any more. His vision was darkening. He was breathing in counts of 4, just as he'd been taught. There was no one nearby. Everyone was down below, on the wall, with the wounded, with the dead. He was alone on his rock, a commander who couldn't hold a sword, who couldn't run, who could only think and send men to their deaths, and who had just brought a mountain crashing down on 10,000 men.
He closed his eyes and saw them. Not Canval soldiers. People. Someone's sons. Someone's fathers. Who went to war because the emperor ordered them to, and whom he had buried under a rock.
That was the price. Dominic Khan, a former Special Forces major, knew the price. He had paid it in Afghanistan. He was paying it here. And he would pay it until the end. After the battle, silence fell. General Yu led the army over the mountain passes. The Canval banners vanished from the valley. The smoke cleared. The dead remained. Dominic ordered everyone to be buried, friends and foes alike. General Juan objected. He said it was not customary to bury enemies, that their bodies should be left as a warning. Dominic replied that the dead were not enemies. The dead were simply the dead, and that diseases from decomposing bodies would kill more people than any army. General Juan fell silent and sent his men to dig. The burial took 3 days. Hylian's losses amounted to 312 killed and 670 wounded. 44 of them were seriously wounded. Yona's field first aid kits saved at least 100 lives. The wounded, who in past wars would have been left to die on the battlefield, now lay in the infirmary with their wounds bandaged and a chance to survive. Yona hadn't slept for 4 days. She worked with the hands of a pianist that didn't tremble even when people were screaming and dying. She stitched up wounds. She applied tourniquets. She cleaned them with alcohol. She changed the bandages. The 4 medics she had trained worked alongside her. They saved people whom the system of this world had already written off. On the 4th day after the battle, Dominic came to the infirmary. He walked past every bed. The system displayed the condition of each wounded person. He stopped at each one. He said their names. He asked how their wounds were. Not just as a formality. He knew them all. Every one of the 5,000 defenders of the pass, not by face, but by name. The system kept records. He remembered. One soldier, an old man, around 50. He lost his left arm below the elbow. A tourniquet saved his life. Without it, he would have bled out in 10 minutes. He lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling. When Dominic approached, the soldier turned his head. He looked at the prince and said that 10 years ago, in the war for the western border, he had lost 3 friends. Not from their wounds, from the infection that followed their wounds. There was no one to bandage them. They were left lying on the battlefield. They died over the course of 3 days, but today they had cut off his arm, and an hour later a girl doctor had sewn up the stump, washed it with some stinking liquid, and said he would live. And he would live. The soldier fell silent. Then he asked what the girl doctor's name was. Dominic said, Han Yun. The soldier nodded. He said he would remember. Dominic left the infirmary and found Yun. She was sitting at a table in the doctor's room. Her hands were finally trembling, a reaction after 4 days without sleep. He sat down next to her. He was silent for a minute. Then he said that today she had saved more lives than he had. She didn't answer. She looked up. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep. She looked at him and said quietly that she knew who he was. Not Chiron, someone else. Dominic froze. She continued. She said that the Chiron she had treated for 2 years was different, empty, quiet, with the eyes of a sick animal. The man sitting in front of her now had nothing in common with that boy except his face. Dominic was silent. She didn't ask who he was. She said she knew he wasn't the one, and that she didn't care. Because that boy was dying, and this man saves people. She didn't need to know where he came from. She needed to know that he was real. Dominic looked at her for a long time and told her the truth, briefly, without details. He said he was from another world, that he was a soldier, that he had died and woken up here, that the system helps him scale his knowledge,
that he is not a wizard and not the chosen one, just a man with experience that doesn't exist in this world. Yona listened. She didn't interrupt. When he finished, she nodded, once, just like Minsu. Apparently that's how they speak in this world, briefly and definitively. She became the first person to whom he told the truth, and in doing so he created a bond stronger than love, a shared secret that could cost him everything. On the 7th day after the battle, Dominic set about what he had been putting off, the poisoner. Yona had been working on analyzing the poison for 2 weeks. She had determined its exact composition, mountain aconite, but not just any aconite, processed, a concentrate that could be added to any liquid without altering the taste. Not just any physician could do that.
It required knowledge. It required access to a laboratory. Sarah was digging on her end. Who had access to the prince's kitchen? Who brought the decoction? Who purchased the herbs? The chain of events came together over 2 weeks. The servant who brought the decoction, an old man, loyal, 30 years at court. But the herbs for the decoction weren't given to him by the chief physician. They were given to him by the treasurer's assistant, a man named Nagyong-su. Quiet, unobtrusive, one of those who sits in the corner and writes down numbers. Nagyong-su received the herbs from a merchant in the city. The merchant received them from a man in Kangwol via the southern pass. A chain, 3 links. The merchant, the treasurer's assistant, a servant, and behind them all, the shadow of Chancellor Cho. No, not the Chancellor. Sayre found the last link. Nagyong-su did not receive orders from the Chancellor, from the treasurer. The treasurer received orders from that very same Kangwol envoy who had arrived 3 years ago. Moon Hyung-sik. A parallel network, independent of the Chancellor. The Chancellor wanted surrender. Kangwol intelligence wanted the dynasty's demise. These were different goals within the same country. Dominic now knew who the instigator was. The question was what to do. He came to Nagyong-su at night, alone, without guards. Nagyong-su lived in a small room at the treasury office. Dominic entered, sat down across from him. Nagyong-su woke up and saw the prince. His face turned pale. He knew why they had come. Dominic looked at him. The system displayed a file on Nagyong-su. 36 years old, submissive psychotype, minimal threat level. Note: his 7-year-old daughter is being held in a shelter in Kangwol. Dominic understood. Not a villain, not a conspirator. A broken man. His daughter was a hostage. Kangwol intelligence had taken his child and told him to do as they said, or the girl would die. He did it. For 2 years, he had been slipping poison into the prince's broth. Not because he wanted to, because a 7-year-old girl was sitting in an orphanage 1,000 kilometers away, and her life depended on his obedience. Dominic sat across from this man and thought. In a past life, he had seen this, in Afghanistan. People who became traitors not out of greed, but out of fear for their families. You could hate them, or you could understand them. He didn't choose to hate him. He told Nagyong-su that he knew everything about the poison, about his daughter, about the Kangwol ambassador. Nagyong-su sat there and waited for death. Dominic said his daughter could be saved, not now, but when the time came. If Nagyong-su stopped working for Kangwol and started working for him, a double agent, to keep pretending that the poisoning was going according to plan, to pass false information to Kangwol, and to pass the real information to Dominic. Nagyong-su looked at the prince. Tears streamed down his face. Quietly, soundlessly. He asked why the prince was helping him. He had been trying to kill him for 2 years. Dominic replied that he hadn't been trying to kill him. He had been trying to save his daughter. Those were 2 different things. Nagyong-su nodded and agreed. After the battle at Silver Pass, the fame of Heilin spread across the continent. A small mountain kingdom had stopped an army of 100,000. They couldn't explain it, and they couldn't ignore it. By the third month after Dominic's awakening, people began arriving in Heilin. Merchants, mercenaries, deserters from the Canvolian army, craftsmen looking for work, and spies. Lots of spies. Sar filtered the stream, weeded out the suspicious ones, tracked the new ones. She let some through on purpose. Dominic had taught her a principle from his world. A known spy is more useful than a captured one. Let him watch. Let him report. But what he sees, Dominic controls. Chancellor Cho had lost his standing. After the terms of surrender were exposed and the victory at the pass, his faction at court collapsed. The generals defected to the prince's side. The aristocracy remained silent. The chancellor was still sitting in his office, but his words carried no weight. Dominic did not arrest him, not because he was merciful, because an arrested chancellor is a martyr, and a chancellor without power is a nobody. Let him sit there. Let him weave intrigues into the void. He was in charge of the army. The system had upgraded the rank to B after the battle at the pass. New programs had opened up, coordination at the battalion level, long-range communication between units, urban combat tactics, long-term defense, the system of staff planning. But most importantly, the module that Dominic had been waiting for since day one had opened. Officer training. A training program for mid-level commanders, the very thing without which the army remains nothing more than a mob with weapons. He opened an officer school in the 4th month, 30 cadets, selected from the army and from the ghosts. He taught them himself, every day, 4 hours a day. Tactics, logistics, leadership, map reading, basics of intelligence, decision-making under uncertainty. He taught using a chalkboard. He drew diagrams. He analyzed operations. He set problems. The cadets solved them. He checked their work. He pointed out mistakes. He gave new problems. Paek Son-woo became the senior field training instructor. Hayun taught the assault operations course. Cho In-guk taught reconnaissance. Min-soo taught tracking and mountain survival. Each of his 21 became a link in a chain that stretched from that barn behind the castle wall to this military school. At the same time, Dominic took up economics. Through Evelyn, a stream of Valmorian silver flowed in exchange for mountain ore and timber. The saltpeter contract expanded. Daehyun received an order for 500 crossbows. She hired 10 apprentices. Her father finally stopped resisting. He saw that his daughter was doing what he hadn't been able to do in 30 years. She was creating weapons that were changing the war. By the 5th month, Dominic began preparing for what no one expected of him. An offensive. Not a defense. An offensive. The 3 border provinces that Kangwol had captured 5 years ago. Sparsely populated, mountainous, strategically important. Control of the mountain passes, a buffer zone. He couldn't afford to wait for the next invasion. He had to push the front line beyond the passes, so that the next war, if it came, wouldn't be fought on Heilin territory. The operation was called Silent Dawn. 3 groups. The first under the command of Baek Sung, 50 ghosts. Mission: to capture the Hanrim Pass in the west. The Kangwol garrison at the pass numbered 200 men, demoralized, without reinforcements. General Yu had taken the best men for the main army. The worst were left behind. The second group under the command of Hayun, an assault company and 30 crossbowmen. Mission: to take Chonwon Fortress in the south. A small fortress, 400-strong garrison. But the walls were strong. An assault was needed. The third group was under the command of Che In-guk, a reconnaissance company. Their mission was to cut off the roads between the 3 provinces and prevent the Kangwol garrisons from joining forces. Dominic coordinated from the capital. The reconnaissance tablet was working better now. More fighters in the field meant more data on the map. Signal flares provided communication over distances of up to 15 kilometers. The operation began in the 5th month and ended 13 days later. Baek Sun-woo took the Hanrim Pass in a single night. The garrison surrendered without a fight. 200 men who hadn't been paid in 6 months and had been cooking porridge from tree bark laid down their arms when they saw the ghosts on the walls. Hyun took Chungwon Fortress in 5 days. The assault was brutal. She lost 11 men. 11 names that Dominic would memorize and remember for the rest of his life. But the fortress fell. Chae In-guk had done his job perfectly. The roads were cut off. The Kangwol couriers were captured. 3 provinces were cut off from the empire.
By the 6th month, the 3 border provinces were under Heilin's control. Dominic did not annex them. He declared them a buffer zone, a free territory under Heilin's protectorate. The residents of the provinces, who had lived under Kangwol occupation for 5 years, saw soldiers who did not loot, did not burn, did not rape, who paid for food, repaired bridges, brought a doctor who treated them for free. This was a weapon against which General Yu could offer no defense. In the 6th month, King Heilin IV summoned Dominic, for the first time ever. Dominic entered the king's chambers. The old man lay in bed, thin, gray, breathing with difficulty. Yona stood quietly by the wall. She had been examining the king for the past month. The same poison, mountain aconite, but in a higher concentration. The king had been poisoned longer and more intensely. He could no longer recover. The king looked at his son, at the one he considered his son, and said he had heard about the victory, that he had heard about the ghosts, that the generals spoke the name Chiron with respect, not pity. Then he fell silent for a long time. Then he said he wanted to abdicate, to pass the crown to his son while he still could, before his mind slipped away completely. Dominic stood before the dying old man and felt the weight, not of the crown, of responsibility. He was not Chiron. He was Dominic Khan, a former major from San Antonio. But Chiron was dead, and the kingdom was alive, because he had saved it. He nodded. The coronation took place quietly, without pomp, in the dying king's bedroom. Present were Captain Sun, General Huan, Yona, Ser, and the physician who had first seen the new Chiron on the day of his awakening. The father placed the crown on his son's head. His hands trembled. The crown was heavy, not physically. A week later, Heilin IV died in his sleep. Yona said the poison had finally reached his heart. Dominic buried a man he had never known, and went into mourning for a father he had never had. After the coronation, Dominic received what he needed most of all: legitimacy. Now he is no longer a sickly prince with a band of partisans. Now he is the king of Heilin, and his orders are law. His first decree removed Chancellor Cho from office. He did not arrest him. He did not execute him. He sent him to an estate in the north, under soft house arrest, with full provisions, with the right to correspond, which Tsar read. The chancellor left quietly. He understood he had lost, not to the prince, to time. The world had changed, but he hadn't. By his second decree, Dominic appointed Daeyeon head of the royal armory, over her father's head, by a separate decree bearing the royal seal. Her father came to him. He stood in the doorway. He didn't shout. He didn't demand. He simply didn't understand. His daughter, a 19-year-old girl, the kingdom's chief armorer. How? Dominic showed him the crossbows, showed him the reports. 500 units in 4 months. The quality was higher than that of any other master in the kingdom. New designs, new methods of tempering steel. His daughter had done all of this. The father stood and watched. Then he turned and left. A week later, he came to his daughter's workshop. He stood silently beside her. He picked up a hammer and began to work. Not as a master who had been passed over, as an assistant. Daehyun looked at him. He didn't look up. He just struck the metal, steadily, hard, just as he had taught her when she was 7. She turned away toward the anvil and continued working beside him.
They didn't say a word to each other, and they didn't need to. News from Kangwol came through Evelyn. The emperor had relieved General Yu of his command. Publicly, in the square in front of the palace. The general knelt in the mud while the emperor shouted about disgrace. 7 victories, not a single defeat in 20 years. And one disaster in the Halin Mountains had undone it all. General Yu had been stripped of his titles and exiled. Dominic read the report and sat in silence for a long time. Then he wrote a letter. He sealed it with the seal of Halin. He sent it via Velmore merchants to General Yu Tae-sun in exile. The letter contained an invitation. General Yu received the letter a month later. He read it. He burned it. He remained silent for 2 months. Then he came, alone, without an entourage, without weapons, in plain clothes, on foot across the pass. He was met by Baek Sonu at the checkpoint. He was brought to the capital. General Yu entered the throne room and stopped. He looked at the young king, at the one who had destroyed his army, brought a mountain down on his cavalry, burned his supply trains, killed his officers, and called him not as a prisoner, but as a guest. The general dropped to one knee. He laid his sword at Dominic's feet and said he wanted to understand, that he was too old to change his faith, but he wanted to understand what this boy believed in, the boy who had defeated him not with force, but with thought. Dominic rose from his throne. He approached the general. He picked up his sword and returned it to him. He said he didn't need his faith. He needed his experience. 20 years of command, 7 victories, insider knowledge of the Kanval army, and the ability to teach officer cadets what only those who have experienced real war know. General Yu taught classical tactics. Dominic taught the new ones. The cadets studied under both, and for the first time on this continent, 2 worlds of military art met not on the battlefield, but in a classroom. Kanval sought peace, not out of magnanimity, out of necessity. The loss of 20,000 at the pass, the loss of 3 provinces, a general in exile, an army demoralized. The emperor could not afford a second campaign. Negotiations were conducted through Evelyn. Velmore acted as a mediator. The terms were simple. Kanval would recognize Halin's independence, recognize the buffer provinces, pay compensation, return Na Gyeong-su's daughter. Dominic personally included the last point. The negotiations lasted 2 months. Kanval haggled over every line. Dominic did not give in. He could afford to be patient. Time was on his side. Every month, his army grew stronger. Every month, the Kanval army grew weaker. By the end of the first year, the peace treaty was signed. Na Gyeong-su's daughter arrived in Hailin 3 weeks after the signing. A little girl of 8, skinny, frightened. She didn't recognize her father. He had changed over the past 2 years. He had aged. His hair had turned gray. But when he picked her up, she clung to him and wouldn't let go for 2 hours. Dominic stood to the side and watched. Then he left. There was no need to say anything. Na Gyeong-su remained in service, voluntarily. He became one of the kingdom's best financiers. The man who had tormented the prince for 2 years was now calculating the budget for him, because Dominic hadn't executed him, but had saved his child. The year had ended. Dominic stood on the castle wall and looked out at the city. He had changed over the course of the year. Not the city, himself. His body weighed 68 kilograms.
He could run 10 kilometers. He could do 12 pull-ups. He could draw a light bow. Yona kept an eye on his health. The antidote was working. The poison was being flushed out slowly but surely. He stood on the wall and thought about how, a year and 5 months after his death in a San Antonio parking lot, former Major Dominic Khan had become king of a mountain kingdom, that he had an army, a military academy, trade contracts, intelligence, allies, and 6 women, each of whom had changed his life as much as he had changed theirs. Heyun stood beside him in her armor, with a conchar on her belt, silently. She didn't speak of feelings. She stood beside him. That was enough. A year and a half after his awakening, the world around Heilin began to change, not for the better. The Sekjong Empire to the west looked at the mountain kingdom and saw a threat, not a military one, an ideological one. A small country had proven that it was possible to defeat the many without having the many, that officers from the common people were better than generals from the aristocracy,
That a woman could command an assault company. That a former deserter could become the best field commander on the continent. These were dangerous ideas. If they spread, every small kingdom on the continent would realize that it could resist. Every peasant would realize that his son could become an officer. Every woman would realize that her place was not just by the hearth. Sejong could not allow this. Intrigues began. Trade sanctions, pressure on Velmore, spies in Heilin, attempts to bribe officers, attempts to poach craftsmen. Dominic saw the pattern. He had seen it in his past life, the Cold War, not tanks and missiles, money and information, subversion from within. He called a council meeting, an expanded one. Captain Sun is now General Sun, General Huang, General Yu. Haiyun is now a colonel. Baek Sun is the commander of the Ghosts. Sare is the head of intelligence. Evelyn is Velmore's trade representative with the unofficial status of advisor. Yona is the kingdom's chief physician. Daehyun is the head of the arsenal. Dominic presented his analysis. Sejong is preparing for war, not direct, indirect. A coalition of small states around Heilin, controlled by Sekjong's money and officers. Formally, others are waging the war. Sekjong remains untainted, a classic proxy war. General Yu listened and nodded. He knew Sekjong. Kang Wol had fought them twice. Sekjong doesn't get into battle itself. Sekjong pays others. Dominic proposed a counter-strategy, not defense, not an offensive, diplomacy. Invite military observers from every state on the continent to Heilin. Let them see the officer training school. Let them see the army. Let them see that Heilin is not a threat, but a model. Open a school for foreign cadets, free of charge. Let the sons and daughters of the small kingdoms study under Heilin. In 10 years, every throne on the continent will be occupied by an officer trained in Dominic's methods. Not an agent, not a spy. Just a person who knows that war fought by 300-year-old rules is suicide. Evelyn smiled. For the first time during the entire meeting, she understood what he was doing. He wasn't exporting weapons, not soldiers. Ideas. The most dangerous weapon in any world. In the 20th month, Dominic found a diary. He had been exploring an abandoned watchtower in the northern mountains. An old one, long forgotten, built 200 years ago. Inside, amid the rubble and dust, lay a chest. In the chest, a book. Handwritten, yellowed. The ink had faded, but the text was legible. Dominic opened the first page and paused. The text was in English, modern English. In a world where such a language did not exist. His hands did not tremble. His hands were still. He read, "The diary belongs to a man named James Morrow, a captain in the British Empire's army, killed in 1916 at the Somme. He woke up in this world 200 years ago, in the body of a prince of a small kingdom in the south. He received the system, the same one.
He tried to do the same thing Dominic was doing: reform the army, train the people, change the world. He didn't make it. He was killed in his second year. A court conspiracy, a knife in the back, literally. The diary ended mid-sentence, the last entry. If anyone finds this and understands these words, it means you're next. The system isn't a gift, it's a tool. Someone created it. Someone chooses us. I don't know who. I don't know why. I only know that he lost.
Don't repeat my mistakes. Take care of the people who stand by you, and don't trust those who serve you tea. Dominic closed the diary, put it back in the chest, sat down on the stone floor of the tower, and sat there for an hour. He wasn't the first. Someone had been here before him, 200 years ago, with the same system, with the same mission, and lost. That meant two things. First, the system isn't a coincidence. Someone created it. Someone chooses people from his world, military personnel, transports them here, gives them tools. Why? Second, his death in the San Antonio parking lot wasn't an accident. The knife wasn't an accident. Someone arranged his transport, someone who knew about the system. Someone is waiting. There is a person on this continent who knows the answers, and that person is waiting for the legend of King Hailin to become loud enough to step out of the shadows. Dominic took the diary. He returned to the capital. He didn't tell anyone, not even Yone. It wasn't time yet. He put the diary in a chest under the bed, next to the blueprints, next to the maps, next to the things that defined his life. And he went back to work. Because the main secret could wait. People couldn't. 3 years had passed since the day Dominic Hahn opened his eyes on the cold sheets in the dimly lit bedroom. 3 years since the former Special Forces Major became the third prince of the Mountain Kingdom. Hailin had changed. The city had expanded. New neighborhoods had sprung up around the old walls. The blacksmith district, where 200 craftsmen worked under Daehyun's leadership. The medical quarter, where Yona had opened the continent's first school of field medicine. The officer training school on the hill outside the city. 50 cadets from 12 countries. General Yu taught classes on classical tactics every morning. Then he switched with Dominic. The old school and the new, side by side. Not in place of, side by side. The ghosts of the past had become a legend. 200 fighters, the best on the continent. People who started out as a poacher and a thief clerk and a mountain shepherdess and a deserter. Each of them now bore a name. Each knew who he was. Each knew why. Peksonu commanded them, that very deserter who had been brought in chains 3 years ago. Now he is a colonel. His 8 who died on the bridge had names carved in stone at the city's main gate. The first memorial to soldiers in the history of this world. Not to generals, not to knights. Soldiers. Hailin's army numbered 12,000. Not the largest on the continent. But every officer had been through training. Every soldier was trained. Every unit was coordinated. The supply system worked. The medical corps saved the wounded. Intelligence knew what was happening on all 3 borders at once. A small army that was worth 3 large ones. The Sejong plot had failed. The coalition of small states fell apart when 4 of the 6 kingdoms sent cadets to Hailin. Sejong could not go to war against its own puppets. The emperor of Sejong sent an envoy, not with threats, with a proposal for a trade agreement. Dominic agreed, not because he had forgiven them, because trade binds more tightly than ropes. Kang Wol remained silent. The new general who replaced Yu was incompetent, and everyone knew it. The emperor was wise enough not to repeat the mistake. Hailin was no longer a victim. It was the center. In the spring of the 3rd year, Dominic stood in the castle courtyard and watched as the cadets of the officer training school marched out for morning roll call. Among them were the sons of the Volhynian aristocrats, the daughters of Sejong generals,
heirs to principalities he hadn't heard of 3 years ago. They marched together, studied together, ate from the same pot, and slowly began to understand what Dominic had been trying to explain from day one. There are no weak soldiers. There are commanders who haven't discovered what a man is made for. That evening he gathered his own. Not a council, not a staff meeting, just dinner. In a small room on the 3rd floor of the tower, the very same one where he and Ser had drawn up a map of the courtyard 3 years ago. 6 people sat at the table. Hayun to his right, in light clothing, without armor. She smiled more often than she had 3 years ago. The wall she had been building for 26 years had cracked the day he showed her the armor blueprint. Now, light was seeping through the crack. Their first kiss happened after the battle at the pass, in a tent, without words. She smelled of blood and iron, and he thought it was the most beautiful scent in the world. Minsu on the left, 20 years now. She'd grown up. She'd grown strong, in good boots, the best scout on the continent. She still slept by his door when she spent the night at the castle, not on the threshold like before, in the room next door. But the door between them was always open. She loved him, quietly, desperately, the way people love who don't know they have the right to. Dominic knew, and he was careful with that knowledge. Yona, across from him, calm, with a soft voice, the only one who knew the whole truth. Between them was a bond that had no name in either his world or this one. Deeper than love, quieter than friendship, a shared secret and a shared code of ethics. She had saved thousands of lives, and every life saved was a thread between her and Dominic. Evelyn beside Yona, fair-haired, witty. The Cartwright family had become one of the wealthiest in Velmore. The compass worked, new routes were opened, trade flourished. She came to Heilin 4 times a year, officially as an ambassador, unofficially as the only person who understood that Dominic wasn't from here and didn't ask questions. Between them was a flirtation on the level of diplomacy, an intellectual closeness that was their form of love. Ser by the window, with a cup of tea, with a seal on a cord around her neck, a crane over the lake. She had worn it without taking it off for 3 years. The head of intelligence whom the court still considered a quiet hostage with a kaya gym. It was the best cover in the world. She saw in Dominic what no one else saw, not a king, not a hero, a weary man. And that look warmed him more than any victory. Daehyun, at the other end of the table, eating for 2, her hands bore burn marks. She'd traded her apron for a workshop jacket. Head of the armory, the continent's finest armorer. Her father worked alongside her, silently and steadfastly. Like all people who don't know how to ask for forgiveness, but know how to show it through their actions. She forged a dagger for Dominic. Lightweight, simple, with a handle into which she had woven a lock of her hair. She didn't tell anyone. He knew, because the system showed it. He didn't tell her he knew. Some things don't need to be said. They had dinner. They talked. They laughed. Minsu told a story about how a cadet from Sejong saw a bear during training in the mountains and climbed a tree fully equipped in 3 seconds. Daehyun demonstrated a new mechanism for her crossbow that jams every 10 shots, and she couldn't figure out why. Evelyn discussed a new route across the South Sea with Sare, and both spoke at the same time in different languages and understood each other. Hayun was silent, holding her cup with both hands. She wasn't the type to talk much. She was the type who was just there. Yona looked at Dominic across the table, quietly, calmly, like a doctor monitoring a patient, or like a woman who knows a man better than he knows himself. After dinner, Dominic climbed the wall, alone. The night was warm, unfamiliar stars. In 3 years, he still hadn't learned their names. He thought about James Morrow's diary, about the system, about who chooses them and why, about how his death in the parking lot wasn't an accident, about how somewhere on this continent,
A man with answers was waiting. He thought about the parking lot in San Antonio, about the knife in his kidney,
about the 12 minutes, about how the world ended and began anew. He thought about the choice, to stay or to return. If there was someone who had brought him here, then perhaps there was a way back. But he looked down. In the courtyard, Minsu was sharpening a knife by the fire, a habit from a past life she hadn't given up. Hayun was checking on the guards, a silhouette in armor, a straight back. A light was on in the window of the medical wing. Yona was working late, as always. He could hear the sound of a hammer from the smithy, Daehyun, the night shift. She wouldn't leave until she figured out that jammed mechanism. Somewhere in the tower, Sayer was reading reports by candlelight. A crane on a string swayed in time with the turning of the pages. Somewhere across the sea, Evelyn was charting a new route using the tables he had given her. His people, not subjects, not soldiers. His people. He found a place for each of them. He gave each of them what the world had taken from them. Boots made to measure, armor that fit perfectly, a seal with their real name, a first aid kit that saves lives, a blueprint that makes a family rich, a position she deserved. He didn't say, "I care about you." He said, "I calculated the grip for your hand." And that was stronger than any confession. He looked at the stars, unfamiliar, alien, and he realized they were no longer strangers. Somewhere down there, beneath those stars, lay a continent that 3 years ago lived by rules 300 years old, where a general without a title does not command, where a woman does not fight, where a soldier is mere meat, where war is phalanxes in an open field and a beautiful death by flags. This world was changing, slowly, with a creak, with resistance, but it was changing. Because in a small mountain kingdom, a man once woke up who knew things could be different. And he wasn't going to stop. Not because the system ordered it, not because someone chose him for a mission, but because he was Dominic Kahn, a former major, a former instructor, a former dead man, the current king. And he believed in one thing that no system could provide, that every person is made for a purpose, and that a commander's task is to find out what that purpose is. He stood on the wall and watched the rising sun. Over the mountains. Over the mountain passes littered with Canvolian banners 3 years ago. Over the city that had doubled in size. Over a world that was changing. And quietly, to himself, he said 2 words in English. Dominic smiled. He turned and walked down. To the people. To the work. To the life he hadn't chosen, but which had become his. Because the first day was long over, and all the rest lay ahead.